At 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday in November, Olivia Bennett discovered that $40 million had vanished from her company's accounts, and that every single piece of evidence had been arranged with surgical precision to make it look like she had taken it herself. By midnight, her phone had stopped ringing, not because no one knew, because everyone did, and not one of them called to ask if she was okay. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like if you're staying until the end, because what happens next will change the way you think about trust, loyalty, and the people standing right in front of you that you never bothered to see. The storm came in fast that evening, the way bad things always do, without enough warning to prepare and with no interest in apology. By 6 p.m., rain was already hammering the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 47th floor of Arcturus Tower, the kind of rain that turns Manhattan into a blur of smeared lights and hurrying shapes. Most of the Arcturus Technologies staff had cleared out by 6:30. Assistants grabbed their bags, developers shut their laptops, the receptionist turned off the lobby fountain that Olivia had always privately thought was excessive, but kept because the interior designer had insisted it projected arrival energy, whatever that meant. Olivia stayed. She always stayed. That wasn't discipline or dedication, not really. It was something closer to habit, or maybe avoidance. The office was the one place where she knew exactly who she was supposed to be. 30 years old, CEO, founder, the woman who had built Arcturus Technologies from a two-person LLC operating out of a converted garage in Brooklyn into a company currently valued at $1.4 billion. That was the version of herself that made sense here, under the recessed lighting, behind the wide glass desk that she'd never actually liked, but had accepted because it looked serious in photographs. Her apartment, on the other hand, felt like a place she visited occasionally. She kept meaning to buy actual furniture. She kept not doing it. So she stayed in the office that night, working through a presentation for the Q4 investor call, half a cup of cold coffee sitting forgotten beside her laptop, rain streaking the windows in long diagonal lines. She was adjusting a slide about projected infrastructure costs when her secondary monitor, the one connected to the internal finance dashboard, blinked. She almost didn't look at it. She had trained herself over the years to ignore the peripheral things, the notifications and alerts and pings that pulled you out of the thing that actually mattered. Focus was a skill she had worked hard to build. Stay on the task. Finish the thought. But the number on the secondary screen was wrong in a way that snagged her attention before her discipline could catch up. She looked. The account balance on the Arcturus primary operating account read $3.2 million. It should have read $43.7 million. She sat very still for a moment, the kind of stillness that comes not from calm but from the brain refusing to process something too large all at once, breaking it into smaller pieces, trying to find the angle where it makes sense. She told herself it was a display error, a refresh issue. She'd seen the dashboard glitch before. Marcus from the dev team had filed a ticket about it twice. She clicked refresh. The number didn't change. She opened the transaction ledger. The transfers had started at 4:18 p.m. and continued in intervals, 15 separate transactions, ranging from $1.8 million to $4.2 million, spread across a 70-minute window, all routed through a shell account she had never seen before, under an authorization code that had her CFO Daniel Hargrove's access stamp on it. And beneath his access stamp, as co-authorizing executive, was hers, her digital signature, her authorization code, on $40 million of fraudulent transfers she had never touched. "No," she said aloud, to nobody. Her voice came out flat and strange in the empty office. She grabbed her phone and called Daniel. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. His smooth professional voicemail message, the one he'd spent 20 minutes recording because he wanted it to sound approachable but authoritative. She hung up and called again. Voicemail. She called Marcus in IT. He picked up on the second ring, sounding groggy. "Olivia, it's almost... I need you to look at something on the finance dashboard right now. Log in remotely. I'll wait." A pause. She could hear him moving, probably sitting up in bed. "Okay, give me a second. Now, Marcus." Another pause. Shorter. The sound of a laptop opening. "Okay, I'm in. What am I..." He stopped. She heard his breathing change. "Olivia, what... This can't be right." Is it a display error? I don't. Let me check the back end. A long silence. Too long. No, these transactions processed. They actually went through. This is Olivia, the authorization on these. I know what the authorization says. Your credentials are on. I know. Silence. I didn't do this, Marcus. I know that, he said, but the way he said it, quickly, reflexively, made it clear he was saying it because she'd said it first, not because he was certain. And that small hesitation, that fraction of a second, felt like the first crack in a wall she hadn't known existed until it started coming down. Lock the affected accounts, she said. Everything tied to those routing numbers. Don't let anything else move. I'll need to loop in the finance team. Do it quietly. Don't send a mass alert. Call only the people you need and tell them to keep it internal until I say otherwise. Olivia, please. She never said please like that, like she was asking for something she wasn't sure she'd be given. She heard him notice it. Okay, he said. Okay, I'll handle it. She hung up and sat there, and for the first time in a very long time, she didn't know what to do next. She knew intellectually that she should call legal counsel immediately. She knew she should get ahead of it, control the narrative, loop in the board chair before someone else did, have a statement ready. She had been in difficult situations before. She'd navigated a hostile acquisition attempt at 26, a product recall at 28, a data breach that could have ended the company if she hadn't handled it with relentless, exhausting precision. She knew how to manage crises, but those crises had come from outside. From competitors, from bad luck, from the unpredictable machinery of the market. This was different. This had her name on it. Someone had reached inside the architecture of everything she'd built and planted something poisonous directly beneath her signature, and she didn't know how they'd gotten in, or how long it had been there, or how many other people were already seeing what Marcus had just seen. She called the board chair, Franklin Cross, at 8:15 p.m. He picked up immediately, which told her he'd already heard. Olivia. Not a question. Her name, flat and careful, like he was measuring it. Franklin. I'm calling because I know why you're calling. A pause. She could hear voices in the background, muffled, other people in the room. We've been on a call for the last 40 minutes. The we landed like a stone dropping into water. She felt the ripples. I didn't do this, she said. Same words she'd said to Marcus, but to Franklin they came out differently, not raw, more controlled. She needed him to hear competence, not fear. Olivia, he sighed. The specific sigh of a man who had already made up his mind and was sorry about it in the abstract, distant way of someone who wouldn't lose any sleep. The evidence is fabricated. You're saying your digital credentials were used without your knowledge? Yes. On 15 separate transactions over 70 minutes. Yes. A silence that stretched long enough to become its own statement. We're going to need to convene an emergency board meeting, he said finally. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. I'd advise you to bring legal representation. Franklin, I'm sorry, Olivia. And maybe he was, a little. Maybe that was real. 9 o'clock. The call ended. She put the phone down on the desk and looked at it for a moment. And then she looked at the rain on the windows. And then she looked at her hands, and the absence of sensation in them scared her more than the board meeting. She was good at managing fear. She had gotten very good at converting fear into momentum. Take the next step, make the next call, solve the next problem. But this fear wasn't converting. It was just sitting there inside her chest like a stone, cold and heavy and still. The next 2 hours were a controlled disaster. Her general counsel, Victoria Lamb, arrived at the office by 9 p.m. and spent 45 minutes going through the transaction records with the expression of someone who wanted very badly to find an alternative explanation and kept failing to. Victoria was excellent at her job and had been Olivia's legal counsel for 3 years. She was also someone who had always been more careful than loyal, and Olivia could see her recalibrating in real time, the way a ship adjusts its course when it spots rocks. The authorization trail is clean, Victoria said finally, closing her laptop. Whoever did this had your credentials, your actual credentials, not a copy, and used them correctly. There's no technical anomaly, no sign of a hack on your personal access portal. Which means what? Victoria looked at her steadily. Which means that the technical record doesn't support the explanation that someone external accessed your credentials. From a record standpoint, the transactions look authorized. By me. By you. Olivia watched Victoria's face very carefully. Do you think I did this? Victoria blinked. A trained, careful pause. My job is... I'm not asking what your job is. I'm asking what you think. A longer pause. I think you're my client, and I intend to represent your interests vigorously. That was not an answer to the question she'd asked. They both knew it. Go home, Victoria, Olivia said quietly. I'll call you in the morning. Olivia, you shouldn't be alone right now. I'm fine. She wasn't fine, but she needed Victoria to leave before she stopped being able to pretend she was. After Victoria left, the office felt enormous and strange. The cleaning crew came through at 10 p.m. She heard them working their way down the hall, the distant hum of a vacuum, the clatter of an equipment cart. She didn't look up. She sat at her desk and stared at the transaction records and tried to find something, any crack, any inconsistency, any thread loose enough to pull, and found nothing. By 11 p.m., 3 board members had texted. 2 were formal and non-committal. The third, James Whitfield, who had been on the board since the Series B, and who she had privately considered one of her actual allies, sent 4 words, "Please do the right thing." She read that text 3 times. Then she set her phone face down on the desk and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. Do the right thing. As if the right thing here was to walk into that boardroom tomorrow and hand over the company to people who had apparently decided she was guilty before she'd had the chance to explain a single word. As if dignity required compliance with someone else's verdict. She took her hands away from her eyes and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she heard, from somewhere down the hall, the sound of a mop bucket rolling across tile. She hadn't thought about the night maintenance crew. She rarely did. Most people in her position didn't, not because they were deliberately dismissive, but because the infrastructure of a building tends to become invisible when you're focused on everything happening inside it. The cleaning crew, the security desk, the maintenance staff, they existed in the margins of the working day, arriving when everyone else left, doing the quiet work of keeping everything functional. She'd been in this office for 4 years, and she didn't think she'd ever had a real conversation with any of them. She heard the bucket stop somewhere nearby, and then silence, and then a knock at her open office door. She turned. A man stood in the doorway wearing the gray Arcturus maintenance uniform, the one with the building management logo on the shoulder. He was maybe 32, with dark hair that needed a cut and the kind of face that wasn't remarkable at first glance, the kind of face you'd look at and then look away from without registering it. But his eyes were paying attention in a way that was specific and unusual, the way certain people look at things. Not at you exactly, but at the full situation you were sitting inside of. He was holding a mop in one hand. He wasn't sure whether to come in. Sorry to interrupt, he said. His voice was quiet, even. Not deferential, just measured. I saw your light on. Wanted to make sure everything was all right. Everything's fine, she said automatically. Then, because it was such an obvious lie, and she was too tired to maintain it, actually no. It's not. But thank you. He didn't leave. He also didn't push forward. He just stood there in the doorway with a patience that was different from politeness. It wasn't waiting for an invitation. It was simply not being in a hurry. You're the CEO, he said. It wasn't a question. I am. Or I was, or I will be for approximately 12 more hours. Olivia Bennett. Ryan Carter, he said. I do the overnight maintenance. I know. She didn't know. She'd never known his name before tonight. He looked at the wall of financial records she had printed and pinned up. Transaction logs, routing numbers, timestamps. And she saw his eyes move across them in a way that was too organized to be casual. That's a lot of paper, he said. I'm trying to understand something. He looked at it for another moment. Then, without asking, he took 3 steps into the office, not all the way, just enough to see better, and studied the wall with his head slightly tilted. Those timestamps are 15 minutes apart, he said. Almost exactly. Every one of them. She blinked. Yes. That's not how people transfer money, he said, still looking at the wall. If someone was manually moving funds, the gaps wouldn't be that regular. That's automated. Something ran a script. She stared at him. How do you know that? He looked back at her then, and something shifted slightly in his expression. Not quite a smile, not quite discomfort, something in between. I used to work in a different field, he said. What field? A pause. He seemed to be deciding something. Cybersecurity, he said finally. Long time ago. The rain was still hitting the windows. The building was quiet except for the distant sound of someone else's cart rolling down a hallway on another floor. Olivia looked at this man, this quiet, unhurried maintenance worker who had just walked into her disaster and immediately seen something she hadn't, and felt something shift inside the paralysis that had been holding her since 8 p.m. Not hope, exactly. Something smaller than that, but something. Someone stole $40 million from my company tonight, she said, and they built the evidence to look like I did it. Ryan Carter looked at her steadily. I know, he said. I've been watching some unusual activity on the building's network nodes for the past 3 weeks. I wasn't sure what it meant until just now. She sat up straighter. 3 weeks? Little things. Data requests hitting servers at odd hours, traffic patterns that didn't match the normal workflow. I reported it to the building's IT liaison. And? He said it was probably nothing, normal maintenance activity. Who was the IT liaison? A guy named Patterson, works days. She made a mental note of the name, filed it next to 12 other things she needed to follow up on tomorrow morning, if tomorrow morning still gave her anything to work with. Why are you telling me this? She asked. He thought about that for a second, not performing thoughtfulness, actually thinking. Because you didn't do it, he said. I can see it in the data, and I don't think it's right for someone to lose everything because someone else built a careful enough lie. She looked at him. You don't know me. No, he agreed, but I know what a frame looks like. He paused. And I know what someone looks like when they're sitting alone at midnight staring at a problem they can't solve by themselves. The office was quiet. Somewhere in the city below, a horn sounded briefly and stopped. The board meeting is at 9 in the morning, Olivia said. I have approximately 9 hours. Ryan Carter leaned his mop against the wall and pulled his phone from his pocket. And from somewhere in the quiet wreckage of that evening, that gesture, practical, unromantic, immediate, was the most clarifying thing she'd seen all night. Then we should start now, he said. She had expected, she wasn't sure what she'd expected. She knew intellectually that people contained depths that their jobs didn't express. She knew that a maintenance worker could have a graduate degree, could have had an entirely different life before the one he was living now. She knew that professional circumstances told you almost nothing about a person's actual intelligence or capabilities, but knowing something intellectually and confronting it directly are different experiences, and watching Ryan Carter sit down at her secondary terminal and navigate through the company's network architecture with the fast, specific efficiency of someone who had spent years living inside systems like this. That was something different from intellectual knowledge. That was just surprising. Your network segmentation is good, he said, moving through screens with a confidence that was entirely unself-conscious. Whoever did this knew the layout, though. They didn't trip any of the standard intrusion flags. Because they used my credentials, she said. Partly, but also because they knew which servers were monitored and which ones had gaps. He paused on a screen. This backup archive. Does anyone regularly access this? She looked at where he was pointing. That's the legacy archive, pre-2021 company data. We migrated everything to the new system 2 years ago. The old archive is technically still accessible, but nobody uses it. Somebody's been using it. He turned the screen so she could see. These access logs. Someone has been pulling from the legacy archive once or twice a week for the past 2 months, pulling financial records from 2019 and 2020. Why would anyone want financial records from 5 years ago? To understand how your authorization system used to work before the migration. The old system had different credential architecture. If someone wanted to understand the gaps, the seams between the old system and the new one where credentials might be replicated without triggering alerts. They'd want to study how the original system was built. She stared at the screen. Who has access to the legacy archive? Executive level and above. And building IT. He looked at her. That's a short list. Walk me through the access logs. He turned back to the screen and began scrolling, and she pulled her chair around to his side of the desk and sat next to him, close enough to see the screen clearly, and for the next 3 hours they worked. Genuinely worked. The way you work when the stakes are high enough to cut through everything else and leave only the problem and the people trying to solve it. He was systematic in a way she respected. He didn't leap to conclusions, didn't get excited about evidence that might not hold up. He found something, examined it from multiple angles, documented it carefully before moving on. He knew how to trace a data thread without contaminating it, knew how to look at a network footprint and understand what it was telling him without projecting onto it. He'd clearly done this before, for a long time, at a level that went well beyond amateur. You were good at this, she said at some point, around 1 a.m., not meaning it as a question. I was okay, he said, which told her he'd been more than okay. What happened? Why'd you leave? A pause. He kept his eyes on the screen. My wife died, he said. 3 years ago. My daughter was 5. I needed work I could control, hours I could predict, nothing that required me to be on call or traveling. Maintenance work? You can work a shift, and then you go home. He paused. She needs me to go home. Olivia sat with that for a moment. She didn't reach for the right thing to say because she didn't think there was a right thing to say, and she had enough respect for him not to reach for something inadequate. What's her name? She said instead. Sophie. And the way his face changed when he said it, briefly, just a small shift around the eyes, told her more about him than anything else he could have said. How old? 8. She's in 3rd grade. He stopped, almost like he'd surprised himself by starting. She's really something. She sounds like it. He glanced at her sideways, briefly. Sorry, you don't need my... No, Olivia said. I asked. And she had asked, and she'd meant it. And somewhere in the middle of the worst night of her professional life, she found herself genuinely curious about the 8-year-old daughter of the man who was quietly trying to save her company. Around 1:30 a.m., Ryan found the access log entry that made both of them stop. It was from 6 weeks ago. A login to the Legacy Archive, executive credentials, 11:43 p.m., well after business hours. The credentials belonged to Daniel Hargrove. Your CFO, Ryan said. Daniel, she said. The name felt different in her mouth than it had 4 hours ago. Daniel, who had been with her since the beginning, since the Series A, since the first office that was barely large enough to hold 4 people and a whiteboard, since the months when she wasn't sure they were going to make it and he'd stayed anyway and told her they would. 11 years. He's been with me since the start. I know. Ryan's voice was careful, not unkind, but honest. That's probably why nobody looked at him. She didn't say anything. Ryan kept scrolling, found 3 more late-night access instances, all under Hargrove's credentials, all pulling from the same section of the Legacy Archive, the 2019 to 2020 financial records that documented the original authorization structure for the company's banking system. He was studying how to forge your sign-off, Ryan said quietly, looking for the version of your credentials that could be replicated in the new system. He needed to understand the old architecture to find the bridge. Daniel has his own credentials, she said. Why use mine? Because if the fraud was authorized by you, the investigation points at you. If it was authorized by him alone, the investigation starts with him. He looked at her. He needed a cosigner to make this look like executive misconduct rather than a CFO acting alone. And your co-signature carries more weight. You're the CEO. A board would move faster to remove you than to question the CFO. That's... She stopped, thought about it, felt the pieces move into a shape she didn't want to see. The board vote to remove me. That's the end game. Not just the money, the company. If you're removed for cause, Ryan said, what happens to your ownership stake? She knew the answer. She'd written those bylaws herself, a long time ago, when she was young and hadn't imagined she'd ever be on the wrong side of them. It triggers a dilution clause. My voting shares revert to Treasury during a governance review. The board has effective control. And who controls the board? She stared at the screen. Franklin Cross chairs it, but James Whitfield— She stopped. James Whitfield, who had texted her tonight, "Please do the right thing." James Whitfield is the largest single board shareholder outside of my stake. What's his relationship with Hargrove? She opened her mouth to say she didn't know, and then she stopped, because she did know something. A small thing she had filed away at the time as irrelevant. They were at Stanford together, same year. I always knew they knew each other. She paused. I never thought it mattered. Ryan looked at her steadily. It mattered, he said. The rain had slowed. Sometime in the last hour, it had gone from a storm to a steady, quiet fall, and the city outside the windows had settled into its middle-of-the-night version of itself. A few lights, the occasional headlight sweep across the wet street far below. If you bring this to the board tomorrow without more than access logs, Ryan said, Hargrove's lawyers will argue the logs were manipulated, that you fabricated them after the fact. I know. We need the communications. If he was coordinating this with Whitfield and whoever else, there are messages somewhere. Nobody planned something this complicated without leaving a paper trail somewhere. The company email system, she said. Not there. He'd know those are discoverable, personal accounts, encrypted messaging. But there might be— He stopped looking at something on the screen. Does Arcturus use an internal document management system, something separate from standard email? We use Meridian. It's an internal collaboration platform. Messages, file sharing, project documentation. Some executives use it for sensitive discussions because it's internal only. Can you get me into the Meridian backend? She hesitated. That requires my admin override. Which, after tonight, I know. He waited. She thought about Victoria Lamb's careful, professional non-answer, about Franklin Cross's too-flat voice, about James Whitfield's four-word text, about Daniel Hargrove's voicemail, smooth and approachable and authoritative, clicking on after 4 rings, about Sophie, who was 8 years old, who was sleeping somewhere right now, who had a father willing to stay until 1:30 in the morning helping a stranger because it was the right thing to do, and he'd apparently decided that mattered. She turned to her keyboard and typed in her admin credentials. Here, she said, and slid the keyboard toward him. She made coffee sometime around 2 a.m. She had a small machine in the office's private kitchen, the kind she'd bought because she was always here late, and the building's coffee bar closed at 8 p.m. She made 2 cups without asking whether he wanted one and brought them both back, set one beside him. He glanced at it, then at her. Thanks. Don't thank me. You're the one doing the work. You're keeping me company, he said, which was such a simple thing to say that she wasn't sure how to respond to it. She sat back down and watched him work, and drank her coffee, and allowed herself for the first time all evening to feel something that wasn't panic or anger or the cold arithmetic of damage control. Something quieter than those things. Something that didn't have a name exactly, but felt like the specific relief of not being alone with an impossible problem, not having it solved, just not carrying it alone anymore. Ryan found the first Meridian thread at 2:17 a.m. It was a closed project workspace, title listed as Q4 Infrastructure Review. Innocuous enough to ignore, specific enough to find if you knew what you were looking for. 6 participants: Hargrove, Whitfield, a name she didn't recognize at first, and 3 others. The third name, after she looked it up in the company's partner database, turned out to be the managing partner of an investment group called Vantage Meridian Capital, a firm she had turned down twice for acquisition conversations, a firm that had made it very clear, the second time, that her refusal had not been well received. They brought in outside money, she said. Acquisition play, Ryan said. Hargrove and Whitfield get equity stakes in the restructured company. Vantage gets Arcturus at a distressed valuation after the scandal tanks the stock price. He was already reading through the thread. It's all here, the plan, the timeline, the payout structure. He sat back. They've been planning this for 8 months. 8 months? Last February. She tried to remember last February, Tom, the office in those months, Daniel in the meetings, The way he'd looked at her across conference room tables, telling her the quarterly numbers looked solid, telling her the new partnership deal was progressing, telling her everything was fine. "He called me a few weeks ago," she said slowly. "Late on a Wednesday. He just called to check in. He asked how I was doing." She paused. "He never does that." I remember thinking it was strange. Ryan looked at her. "I told him I was fine," she said, "that everything felt good, that I was excited about the company's direction." She stopped. "He said that was great to hear." The silence in the office after that was the kind that fills itself. Ryan closed the thread carefully, making sure not to disturb the data structure, copying the access path for documentation purposes. He was thorough in the way of someone trained to understand that evidence only helps you if it survives the handling. "We need to download and preserve all of this before the board meeting," he said, "and we need to do it in a way that creates an unimpeachable chain of custody. Otherwise, their lawyers will have an argument." "What do you need?" "A few more hours," he said. "And someone from your legal team who you actually trust." She thought about Victoria Lamb's careful non-answer. "I'll make some calls," she said. Outside the windows, the rain had nearly stopped. The city was still wet and dark, but somewhere toward the east there was the first faint suggestion, the kind you're not sure you're really seeing, of the sky beginning to consider morning. "Ryan," she said. He looked up from the screen. "Why are you doing this?" she said. Not the same question as before. A different one. He considered it. He looked like a person who didn't give the answer to that question too quickly. "Because someone where I used to work got accused of something they didn't do," he said finally, "and everyone around them decided the evidence was enough and didn't look any further." He paused. She lost everything. Her career, her house, eventually her marriage. The person who actually did it kept their job. He looked back at the screen. "I didn't speak up. I was 24 and I was scared and I told myself it wasn't my place." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been carrying that around for a long time." She looked at the side of his face. The specific stillness of someone who has learned to carry something heavy and has gotten good enough at it that it doesn't show unless you know what to look for. "You're speaking up now," she said. "I'm trying to," he said, and turned back to the screen and kept working. At 4:40 a.m., with the documentation secured and the evidence packaged into a format that Ryan had explained, methodically and clearly, would withstand technical scrutiny, Olivia sat back in her chair and looked at what they had built over the course of the night. It wasn't perfect. There would be legal arguments, technical challenges, people who would look for any reason to dismiss it. That was the nature of these things. But it was real, and it was documented, and it pointed, clearly, specifically, without wiggle room, in a direction that was not toward her. Ryan had sent her the master file summary and was shutting down the terminal connections, documenting his process in the methodical way he'd done everything all night. "You should get some rest before 9, he said. "Even a couple of hours." "I won't sleep." "You should try." She looked at him. "Do you sleep? When things are hard?" He thought about that. "Not really," he said. "I lie down and I think about Sophie until the thinking is about her instead of the other thing, and then eventually morning comes." She laughed, a short, genuine laugh that surprised her by coming out at all. "That's not exactly a sleep strategy." "It's a survival strategy," he said. The corner of his mouth moved briefly. "Different thing." She stood, because sitting any longer felt like it would pull her under, and walked to the windows. The city below was beginning its slow pre-dawn stir. The first delivery trucks, the earliest dog walkers, the shift changes at places that never fully closed. The rain had left everything clean and reflective, the wet streets catching light from 100 different angles. "Whatever happens at 9, she said, not turning from the window. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he said from behind her. "Bring a good lawyer." "I'm working on that." "And don't let them make you small," he said. "Whatever they say in that room, don't apologize for something you didn't do. Don't give them the version of you that's already defeated." She turned then and looked at him, and he was standing across the office with his jacket on, and his hands in his pockets, and his mop against the wall. And he looked like exactly what he was, an ordinary man, in an ordinary building, in the middle of an ordinary night's work that had turned into something else entirely. And she thought that she had been in rooms full of brilliant and powerful people her entire adult life, and that very few of them had ever given her advice that was this good. "You should go home," she said. "Sophie will be up soon. She's at her grandmother's tonight." A pause. "But yeah." He picked up the mop. "I'll be in the building until 7 if you need anything." "I know where to find you," she said. He nodded once, not a farewell exactly, more of an acknowledgement, one professional to another, standing in the wreckage of a long night, and walked out. She heard the bucket rolling down the hallway, and then the elevator, and then silence. She turned back to the windows. The sky to the east had made its decision overnight, apparently. It was definitely getting lighter now. The specific cold gray of a winter city just before sunrise, not hopeful exactly, but honest. The kind of light that doesn't dress anything up or make promises. Just shows you what's there. She had 4 hours before she walked into a room full of people who believed she was guilty, carrying evidence she hoped was enough. She had the name of a man who had decided, somewhere in the middle of his own quiet life, that the truth was worth staying up for. She had work to do. She went to make more coffee, and she started making calls. The calls she made between 4:40 and 6 a.m. were the hardest kind. The ones where you already know, before the first ring, how the conversation is going to land. She called 3 people she had considered close. Not friends exactly. She'd never been good at maintaining the kind of friendship that required regular emotional availability, but people she trusted. People she'd vouched for, advocated for, spent real time with in the margins between work and everything else. The first one, her head of communications, Diane, picked up on the 4th ring and listened and then said very carefully, "Olivia, I think you need to think about what's best for the company right now." Which was not an answer. Which was an answer. The second didn't pick up at all. The third picked up and said, "I can't be involved in this," before she had finished her second sentence, and that was that. She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment after the third call ended. Not devastated. She didn't have the luxury of devastated right now. But noting the information carefully, the way you catalog damage after a storm so you know what actually needs to be rebuilt. Then she called Nathan Briggs. Nathan was not someone she would have described as a close friend. He was a forensic attorney who specialized in financial crime, a small, meticulous man in his mid-50s who wore the same style of wire-rimmed glasses he'd apparently worn since law school, and who had a reputation in certain circles for being the person you called when the evidence against you was clean and carefully built, and you needed someone who would look at it without blinking. She'd met him twice at industry events. She had his number because someone had told her once, casually, that if she ever needed a forensic specialist, Briggs was the call to make. She had kept the number without knowing why. The way you keep certain things, an instinct you don't examine too closely. He picked up on the second ring. At 5 a.m. Nathan Briggs. "Nathan, this is Olivia Bennett from Arcturus Technologies. I apologize for the hour." A brief pause. "I'm aware of who you are. I've been following the news since about 2 o'clock this morning." It's already in the news. Financial wire services picked up unusual activity in Arcturus accounts around midnight. There's speculation. A dry pause. "You're calling because you didn't do it." "I'm calling because I didn't do it, and I have approximately 4 hours before a board meeting at which they're expecting my resignation, and I have evidence that may be enough if it's handled correctly." A silence. She heard him breathing, thinking. "Tell me about the evidence," he said. She told him. All of it. The transaction logs, Ryan's identification of the script pattern, the legacy archive access trail, the Meridian thread with Hargrove and Whitfield and the Vantage Meridian Capital managing partner. She spoke clearly and without editorial, the way she'd learned to brief investors. Facts first. Context as needed. No wasted words. When she finished, Nathan was quiet for a moment. "Who found the Meridian thread?" She hesitated for less than a second. "A cybersecurity specialist who works in the building. He identified the access patterns." "What's his name?" "Ryan Carter." "Is he credible? Can he testify to how the evidence was located and preserved?" "He documented everything in real time. Chain of custody is intact." And he's willing to come forward? She realized she hadn't actually asked Ryan that specific question. She had assumed, but she hadn't asked. I believe so, she said. He came to me. All right. Another pause. I'll be at your office at 7:30. Send me everything you have electronically right now so I can review it before I get there. Nathan, Ms. Bennett. His voice wasn't unkind, just direct. Send me the files. We'll talk at 7:30. The call ended. She sent the files. Then she sat in the quiet of the office and waited for the city to wake up, and thought about a man with a mop and a daughter named Sophie, and whether he had ever considered that the skill he'd walked away from would one day follow him back. Ryan had told her he'd be in the building until 7. She went down to find him at 6:15. She took the service elevator, the one she'd never been in before, with the scuffed metal walls and the notice about maximum load capacity, and rode it to the basement level where the maintenance staff kept their equipment. She found the main maintenance room without difficulty. The door was propped open with a toolbox. Ryan was inside, at a workbench along the far wall, writing something in a logbook. He had his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up. There was a half-eaten granola bar on the bench beside him that looked like it had been there a while. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway, and something in his face shifted. Not quite surprise, but close. You're still here, he said. I'm always here, she said. It's a problem. She looked around the maintenance room. The pegboard wall of tools, the shelf of chemical supplies organized by type, the whiteboard with a grid of cleaning schedules written in 3 different colors of marker. How long have you been doing this job? 2 years in March. Do you like it? He considered that honestly. Most of the time. He set down his pen. It's quiet. I can think. There's a satisfaction to it. You fix something, it stays fixed. Not everything is like that. She understood that more than she expected to. I called a forensic attorney, she said. He's reviewing the evidence now. He wants to know if you're willing to testify to how it was found and preserved. Ryan didn't answer immediately. He looked at the logbook for a moment, then back at her. What happens if I testify? You'd be called as a witness in any subsequent legal proceedings. Your name would be part of the public record. My name's already part of the building's personnel files. This is different. It's visible. It could get complicated. She paused. I won't pretend otherwise. He was quiet for a moment. She watched him think, really think, not performing consideration, but actually working through something. She'd noticed that about him during the night. He didn't say things until he'd decided them. I'm not worried about visible, he said finally. I'm worried about Sophie. What about her? He looked at Olivia directly. If this gets complicated, if Hargrove's people push back, if there are lawyers involved, if my name ends up in news coverage, I need to make sure it doesn't land on her somehow. She's 8. She shouldn't have to walk into school and deal with something I brought home. Olivia sat down on a stool near the workbench without being invited. It seemed like the appropriate thing to do. This wasn't a conversation to have standing in a doorway. I can work with Nathan to keep your involvement as technical as possible. Expert witness on the cybersecurity elements. Not a character in the story, just someone who identified and preserved evidence. Is that realistic? With the right legal framing, yes. She paused. I won't guarantee things I can't control, but I'll do everything I can to make sure Sophie doesn't carry this. He looked at her for a long moment. She had the feeling he was deciding whether she was someone whose word was worth something. Okay, he said. Okay? I'll testify, if it comes to that. He picked up the granola bar, looked at it, put it back down. How'd the calls go? The ones you made at 5 in the morning? 3 out of 3 people I thought I could count on demonstrated that I was wrong about that. I'm sorry. Don't be. It's useful information. She said it without self-pity because she didn't feel self-pity. She felt the clean, hard clarity of seeing something accurately that you'd previously been seeing wrong. I was bad at maintaining those relationships anyway. I treated them like assets instead of people. You don't get loyalty from assets. Ryan looked at her. That's a hard thing to say about yourself. It's accurate. Accurate and hard aren't the same as true, he said. You can be bad at something and still deserve better than 3 people abandoning you at 5 in the morning. She didn't respond to that, not because she disagreed, but because she wasn't sure she knew how to receive it. She had spent so long in rooms where every statement was strategic, every kindness had an angle, every compliment needed to be assessed for what it was actually asking. That straightforward decency from someone who wanted nothing from her had become a language she could barely read. "I should let you finish your shift," she said, standing. "Olivia." She stopped. It was the first time he'd used her first name without the Ms. that building staff tended to default to. "The attorney, can he actually win this?" She thought about Nathan Briggs' careful voice at 5 in the morning, his question about chain of custody, the way he'd said, "Send me the files," with the tone of someone who planned to use them. "If the evidence is what we think it is," she said. "Yes. The evidence is the thing. Everything depends on whether it holds." "It'll hold," Ryan said. "I documented everything. I've done this before." She believed him, not because she wanted to, but because nothing he had done over the past several hours had given her any reason not to. 7:30, she said. "My office. Bring everything you have on the network access logs." "I'll be there." She left him in the maintenance room and took the service elevator back up. And the whole ride up, she stood in the scuffed metal box and breathed and tried to assemble herself into the shape required for what was coming. Nathan Briggs was exactly what she had expected. Small and precise and apparently immune to being impressed by anything. He arrived at 7:20 in a suit that was well-made and unremarkable, carrying a leather briefcase that had clearly been repaired at least once. He shook her hand with the specific firmness of someone who had decided to be efficient about everything, sat down at her conference table, and opened the files she'd sent him on his laptop without small talk. Ryan arrived 3 minutes later. He'd changed into clean clothes, dark jeans, a gray sweater, and he carried a folder of printed documentation. He'd had just enough time to go home and come back, Olivia realized. He hadn't slept at all. Neither had she. She introduced them and watched Nathan look at Ryan with the assessing expression he'd probably developed over 30 years of deciding who was useful. "You're the one who found the Meridian thread?" he said. "Yes." "Walk me through how." Ryan sat down and walked him through it, methodically, in the same organized way he'd worked through the night. No embellishment, no performance. Just the sequence. The network anomalies he'd noticed over weeks, the access log patterns, the legacy archive access trail, the Meridian project workspace. Nathan listened without interrupting. When Ryan finished, Nathan sat back and looked at the ceiling briefly and then at his laptop. "The chain of custody documentation," he said. "Show me." Ryan opened his folder and passed across a printed log, time-stamped, sequentially numbered, each action documented in the specific format of a professional who understood that how you handle evidence matters as much as what the evidence says. Nathan studied it for a moment. Then he looked at Ryan. "Where did you train?" "NSA fellowship, then private sector, mostly financial institutions." Nathan's expression didn't change, but his posture shifted slightly. A small recalibration. "Why aren't you still doing it?" "Personal reasons," Ryan said, and the flatness of his tone communicated clearly that this was not an avenue Nathan was going to get far down. Nathan looked at him for another second, then back at the documentation. "This is good," he said, not generously, just factually, the way you say a bridge is well built. "The technical documentation will hold up. The question is the Meridian content. We need to ensure the data extraction was performed legally, given that Olivia authorized it using her administrative credentials." "She did authorize it," Ryan said. "Her admin access is documented in the log. Her admin access to a system she controls, accessing data relevant to a fraud investigation she's the subject of." Nathan glanced at Olivia. "That argument has legal vulnerability. They'll claim self-serving evidence gathering." "What do we do about that?" Olivia asked. "We don't walk in there this morning as if we're proving your innocence," Nathan said. "We walk in there as if we're requesting an independent investigation. There's a difference. If we present this as here is proof Olivia is innocent, Hargrove's attorney, and he'll have one in that room, don't underestimate that. We'll spend 30 minutes dismantling the credibility of the collection process. If we present this as here is evidence that demands an independent investigation before any personnel decisions are made, we change the frame." Olivia thought about that. You're asking me to walk into that room not claiming I'm innocent. I'm asking you to walk in there and make it impossible for them to proceed without independent scrutiny. That's different. Nathan looked at her steadily. The goal this morning is not to win. The goal is to prevent them from finishing the game before anyone looks at the board. It was a good distinction. She recognized it as good, even though she hated it. The enforced patience of it, the requirement to not say the thing you most wanted to say, to play the longer game when every instinct was pulling toward the direct confrontation. And the actual evidence, she said, when does that matter? When we have a forensic accountant's independent review and a proper legal process. That takes days, possibly weeks. He looked at her. Today we buy time. That's the objective. Ryan, who had been listening without speaking, said, "What about the Vantage Meridian connection? The investment group?" "That's the piece that turns this from an internal personnel matter into a potential securities fraud case," Nathan said. "An outside investment group coordinating with board members to manipulate a company's leadership structure. That's a federal question. But I won't lead with that this morning. That comes out in the investigation." "Why not lead with it?" Olivia asked. "Because if we reveal everything we know in that boardroom this morning, we give them time to clean up what we haven't found yet." Nathan closed his laptop. "The people who did this are smart. We know they're smart, which means there are things we haven't found. We need the investigation process to uncover those things under controlled conditions." He paused. "We show enough to stop the vote. We hold back enough to win the case." The room was quiet for a moment. "You've done this before," Olivia said. "Many times," Nathan said, without satisfaction. "It rarely goes quickly. I want to make sure you understand that." "I understand." He looked at her and then at Ryan and then back at Olivia. "Is there anything else you found last night that you haven't told me?" "There's one more thing," Ryan said. Both Nathan and Olivia looked at him. He opened his folder again and pulled out a single printed page. "When I was documenting the Meridian access logs, I found a secondary access point. Someone besides Hargrove and Whitfield was reading the Q4 infrastructure review thread." He set the page on the table. "The access credentials belong to an account registered under the name of a building IT contractor, Patterson." "The IT liaison you mentioned," Olivia said, the name clicking into place from the night before. "He's not just a liaison," Ryan said. "He's been accessing internal executive communications for at least 4 months. He's the person who told the building management the unusual network traffic I reported was normal maintenance activity." He looked at Nathan. "He's the inside access point. He didn't just cover for the network intrusion, he probably facilitated it. Hargrove and Whitfield needed someone inside the building's IT infrastructure to set up the bridge between the old authorization system and the new one. Patterson is that person." Nathan picked up the page and studied it. Olivia watched him read it and watched his face stay very still in the way of someone sitting on a significant reaction. "This connects the outside actors to the internal system access," he said. "Yes. This is what ties the whole thing together." "Yes." Nathan set the page down. He looked at Ryan for a moment with the expression of someone reassessing a calculation they'd thought was already complete. "Mr. Carter," he said, "I'd like to retain you formally as a technical consultant for this case." Ryan blinked. "I'm a maintenance worker." "You were a cybersecurity specialist," Nathan said. "The job title on your badge doesn't change what you found last night or how you found it. I need someone who can speak credibly about the technical elements in a legal context, and your documentation work is better than most professionals I work with." He paused. "I'll pay you for your time. Fairly." Ryan looked at Olivia briefly. She kept her face neutral. It wasn't her decision. He looked back at Nathan. "I work nights," Ryan said. "I have a daughter. My availability is limited." "Understood. We work around your schedule." A silence. Ryan looked at the page on the table. He looked like a person standing at the edge of something, taking the measure of it. "All right," he said. At 8:40, Olivia stood in the bathroom off her office and looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment. She looked like someone who had not slept. She had done what she could. She had changed into the spare suit she kept in the office closet, a dark charcoal that she wore when she needed to look like someone not to underestimate. She had washed her face and put herself back together in the external ways, but she looked tired in a way that makeup didn't fully reach. She thought about what Nathan had said. The goal is not to win. The goal is to prevent them from finishing the game. She understood the logic. She understood it was right. She was still going to walk into that room wanting to say, directly, to every single person there, I know who did this, and I know you knew, and I know you made your decision before you called me. She wasn't going to say that, but she was going to feel it, and maybe that was okay. Maybe that was the thing that would keep her from looking like someone who had already given up. She turned off the bathroom light and went back into the office. Ryan was in the hallway, waiting. He was still carrying his folder. He looked like a man who had not slept, but had decided not to acknowledge it. You don't have to come to the meeting, she said. I know, he said. Nathan can present the technical evidence himself. I know. She looked at him. You're coming anyway. You shouldn't walk in there alone, he said simply. Something caught in her throat that she refused to let go any further than that. She straightened her jacket instead. I walked in there alone for years, she said. I know. He held her gaze. But you don't have to today. She thought about what it had cost him to say that. Not just tonight, but in general, to be someone who said things like that and meant them. She thought about the wife he'd lost, the career he'd set down, the maintenance logbook and the scuffed elevator and the half-eaten granola bar and the daughter he went home to with the same quiet integrity he brought to everything else. She didn't say thank you. It would have been insufficient. The meeting is on 48, she said. Let's go. The elevator ride to the 48th floor was 23 seconds. She had taken it hundreds of times. She had never noticed how long it took before. Tell me something about Sophie, she said, because the silence was the wrong kind and she needed something in it. He looked at her, slightly surprised by the request. She's learning piano, he said. She's terrible at it. She practices for 20 minutes every evening and she still can't get the left hand and right hand to cooperate. And she gets this expression on her face, like she's personally offended that the piano is not doing what she wants. The corner of his mouth moved. Last week she told me the piano was broken. I showed her it wasn't. She thought about it for a second and then said, then my hands are broken. I told her hands were fine. She said, then this song is too hard and I'm not playing it anymore. Olivia laughed. The real kind. Did she play it? She played it for 40 minutes straight until she got it right. He shook his head slightly, stubborn as anything. She sounds like someone I know, Olivia said. He glanced at her. I was going to say the same thing. The elevator slowed, settled, and the doors opened on 48. The boardroom was at the end of the hall. Through the glass wall, she could see them already assembled, board members, a few shareholder representatives, two people she didn't recognize who were probably lawyers. Franklin Cross was at the head of the table, talking to someone beside him. Daniel Hargrove was there, in the seat he always occupied, on the right side of the table, 3 chairs from the head. He was looking at his phone. He glanced up when she stepped off the elevator, and for a moment, just a fraction of one, something crossed his face. Not guilt, exactly. Something more complicated than guilt. The expression of someone who had told themselves a story so many times that they almost believed it, confronted without warning by the person the story was about. Then it was gone, and he looked back at his phone. Olivia watched him look back at his phone, and she thought, 11 years. 11 years of coffee in conference rooms, of late nights working through financial models, of 100 small moments of professional intimacy, the kind you build with someone when you're building something together, and you think you're building it together. 11 years of trusting someone with the parts of the company that were most vulnerable, and never once imagining that vulnerability was being studied from the inside. She walked toward the boardroom doors. Nathan fell in beside her on the left. Ryan stayed a step behind, which was the right instinct. Not invisible, but not forward either. Present. Franklin Cross looked up as she pushed open the door. Olivia, he said. Franklin, she said. And then, because she had earned the right to it, let's talk. She set her folder on the table and pulled out her chair and sat down. And she kept her back straight, and she did not look at Daniel Hargrove again. And the meeting began. The first 20 minutes were exactly what she had predicted and prepared for. Franklin Cross opened with procedural language about the board's fiduciary responsibility, the necessity of responding to the financial irregularities, the importance of transparency with shareholders during a period of uncertainty. Two of the board members nodded along. One of them, Carol Brennan, who Olivia had always found impossible to read, was making notes on a legal pad without looking up. A man in a navy suit across the table introduced himself as Garrett Fossey, outside counsel representing the board in matters related to the current investigation. He had the smooth, practiced delivery of someone who had done this specific type of meeting many times. The meeting where someone had already been decided against and the goal was to manage the exit efficiently. "Ms. Bennett," Fossey said, "the board has reviewed the transaction records from yesterday evening. The authorization trail is quite clear. Before we proceed, the board would like to give you the opportunity to make a statement." The invitation to confess? Dressed as an opportunity. "I appreciate that," she said, "and I will make a statement. But first I'd like to present some information that I believe is material to any decision this board makes today." She looked at Franklin. "Nathan Briggs, my legal counsel, will speak to the technical evidence, and Ryan Carter, a cybersecurity specialist, will speak to how the evidence was located and preserved." Fossey glanced at Franklin. Something moved between them. A quick recalibration. "This isn't a—" Fossey started. "It's not a trial," Olivia said. "I agree. It's a board meeting, and board members have a fiduciary responsibility to make informed decisions. The information Nathan is about to present is material to this decision." She paused. "Unless the board has already decided." The room was quiet. Franklin Cross looked at her for a long moment. He was 63, and he had spent most of those years in rooms like this one, and he knew what a prepared counterargument looked like, and she watched him recalculate. "Go ahead," he said. Nathan opened his laptop. Ryan set his folder on the table, and the meeting that was supposed to end Olivia Bennett's career took a turn that nobody in that room, except the three people who had spent the night preparing for it, had been ready for. At the far end of the table, Daniel Hargrove stopped looking at his phone. He put it face down on the table instead, and for the first time since she'd walked in, Olivia looked at him directly. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to be deliberate, not long enough to be theatrical. And then she looked back at Nathan and listened to the evidence she'd spent the night building begin to unfold into the room. Whatever happened next, they were no longer playing on Hargrove's timetable. They were playing on hers, and that, for the first time in 18 hours, felt like solid ground. Nathan spoke for 14 minutes. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't use dramatic language or make accusations he couldn't immediately support. He walked through the evidence the way a person walks through a room they know well, unhurried, certain of where everything was, not needing to perform confidence because the confidence was structural. He laid the transaction timeline on the table first, then the script pattern Ryan had identified, then the legacy archive access trail with Hargrove's credentials stamped across 6 weeks of late-night sessions. He did not yet mention the Meridian thread. He did not yet mention Vantage Meridian Capital. He did not yet mention Patterson. He stopped at the legacy archive and looked up at the room. "What this evidence establishes," Nathan said, "is that someone with executive-level access to Arcturus systems spent 6 weeks studying the original authorization architecture of the company's banking system. The purpose of that study, as the subsequent transactions demonstrate, was to understand how to replicate Ms. Bennett's credentials in a context that would not trigger standard fraud alerts." He paused. "This is not consistent with the narrative that Ms. Bennett authorized these transfers. This is consistent with a sophisticated internal operation designed to make it appear that she did." Garrett Fossey, the board's outside counsel, had been making notes throughout. He looked up now. "Mr. Briggs, the access logs you're referencing. Can you speak to how this evidence was collected? Specifically, who collected it and under what authorization?" "Ryan Carter, who is present at this table, can speak to that directly," Nathan said. "Mr. Carter is a former NSA-trained cybersecurity specialist who identified anomalous network activity in this building over a period of weeks prior to last night's events. He documented the evidence collection process in real time with full chain of custody records." Every head in the room turned toward Ryan. Ryan had the specific quality of someone who was comfortable being looked at without enjoying it. He sat with his folder on the table in front of him and met the room's attention without flinching and without performing. "Mr. Carter," Fossey said, with the careful neutrality of someone who had just noticed something unexpected, "you work in building maintenance?" "I do," Ryan said. "And you have an NSA background?" "I did. Before that." A brief silence. Fossey glanced at his own notes, recalculating something. "Walk me through your methodology last night," he said. Ryan walked him through it. Same account he'd given Nathan that morning. Clear, sequential, technically specific in the places where technical specificity mattered. He explained the anomalous network traffic patterns he'd been logging for 3 weeks. He explained how, after seeing the transaction records Olivia had on her office wall, he recognized the signature of an automated script. He explained the legacy archive access trail and how he documented each discovery before proceeding to the next. When Ryan mentioned the 3-week anomaly log, Fossey stopped him. "You were logging network anomalies for 3 weeks, Fossey said slowly. "Before last night?" "Yes." "And you reported this?" "To the building's IT liaison, a contractor named Patterson. He told me it was routine maintenance activity." The name sat in the room for a moment. Franklin Cross looked up from his notepad. "Patterson, that's the IT contractor on building services?" "The same one," Nathan said, and now he reached into his own folder and pulled out the final page, the secondary access log showing Patterson's credentials reading the Meridian thread. He set it on the table and slid it toward Franklin. "Mr. Patterson has been accessing executive-level internal communications through the Meridian platform for approximately 4 months. His credentials appear in the access logs for the project workspace where the scheme was coordinated." Nathan paused. "He is the technical bridge between the external actors and Arcturus's internal systems." The room was very quiet. Franklin Cross picked up the page and read it. His face was doing something complicated. The face of a man who had been certain of the shape of a situation and was now watching it change into a different shape entirely, not sure yet where the new edges were. Carol Brennan, who had been making notes throughout without looking up, finally looked up. "Who are the external actors?" she said. Nathan looked at Olivia. This was the moment they had discussed. The Meridian thread, the full content, the names, the payout structure, the 8 months of coordination. Nathan had advised holding it. Show enough to stop the vote, hold back enough to win the case. Olivia looked at the table. She looked at Daniel Hargrove, who had not moved or spoken since the meeting began, who was sitting very still with his hands flat on the table in front of him. A stillness so deliberate it was its own kind of signal. She looked at James Whitfield, 3 seats away, who was looking at his own hands. She thought about Nathan's logic. It was good logic. It was the right legal strategy. She understood all of it. "There is additional evidence," she said, "documenting the coordination between internal and external parties. I'm prepared to share that evidence with an independent forensic investigator. I am asking this board, before making any personnel decision today, to appoint an independent investigator and allow that process to run." She looked at Franklin directly. "That's what I'm asking for. Not a verdict, an investigation." Franklin looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Hargrove. And Hargrove, who had 11 years of practice at being unreadable, made the mistake that people who have done something wrong almost always make when the room begins to turn. He spoke first. "This is a delay tactic," he said. His voice was even, professional, the voice she had heard in hundreds of meetings. "Olivia is attempting to muddy the evidentiary waters with a manufactured counter-narrative to buy time before us." "Daniel." Her voice was quiet. Not loud, not angry, just his name, said in a specific tone, and he stopped. "Don't." He looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes. "Don't perform right now," she said. "Not in front of me." The room was so quiet she could hear the ventilation system. Franklin Cross set down the page he'd been holding. He looked at Fossey. Something passed between them. The specific communication of 2 people who had been about to do something and had just understood that doing it carried more risk than they'd calculated. "We're going to take a recess," Franklin said. 30 minutes. But she stepped out into the hallway and walked to the far end, away from the conference room, and stood at the window that looked east over the city. The morning was gray and sharp-edged, the kind of winter morning that didn't pretend to be anything warmer than it was. She could see steam rising from a grate on the street below, and the small, distant shapes of people moving, and a delivery truck stopped halfway in a bus lane with its hazards on. Ryan came and stood beside her. He didn't say anything immediately, which was the right instinct. "Hargrove's going to lawyer up in the next 20 minutes, she said. "Probably already on the phone," Ryan agreed. "It was his face," she said. "When Nathan mentioned Patterson, he didn't know we had Patterson." "Nobody knows everything they haven't hidden yet," Ryan said. She looked at him sideways. "That's a strange sentence." "It means he thought he'd covered everything. He didn't know about the secondary access log because Patterson probably didn't tell him he'd been sloppy." Ryan looked out the window. People who run operations like this rely on every piece working perfectly. When one piece doesn't, the whole structure gets unstable. Patterson is the loose piece. "Patterson is scared right now," Ryan said. "If Hargrove's lawyers reach him before your lawyers do, he'll be coached. But if Nathan gets to him first, Nathan's already got someone trying to reach him." She'd seen Nathan step away from the table during the recess and pull out his phone. "He's good." "He is," Ryan said. It was a straightforward acknowledgement, not deferential, just accurate. She turned to look at Ryan fully. There were things she wanted to say and wasn't sure how to say, which was an unfamiliar position for her. She had spent her adult life being precise with language. In investor presentations, in board meetings, in the controlled negotiations of her industry. She knew how to say things, but the things she wanted to say right now weren't boardroom things. They were different. "You changed the shape of that room in there," she said. "When they saw you sit down at that table and heard what you found, I watched them recalculate. All of them." "I just documented what was there," he said. "Ryan." She waited until he looked at her. "You stayed up all night working on a problem that wasn't yours, for a person you'd never spoken to before. You're going to end up testifying in a federal investigation that's going to have your name attached to it. Your daughter." She paused. "This is going to make your life more complicated, and I want you to know that I understand that." He was quiet for a moment. "I know you understand it," he said. "That's not what I was worried about." "What were you worried about?" He thought about how to say it. "I was worried that you'd win the board meeting and go back to running your company, and this would become a thing that happened, and you'd be grateful in the abstract, but we'd go back to being—" He gestured slightly toward the building around them, toward the distance between the 48th floor and the basement maintenance room. "What we were before." She looked at him. "Which was strangers. Which was people who didn't know each other existed." She held his gaze. "I know you exist," she said. "That's not something that's going back to how it was." He nodded once, not relieved exactly, just settled like something had been confirmed that he'd needed to hear confirmed. They stood at the window for another minute without speaking, and the quiet between them was the comfortable kind, the kind you have to earn. Then Nathan appeared at the far end of the hallway, walking toward them with his phone still in his hand and his face arranged in an expression that she'd learned in a few hours of watching him, meant he had something. "Patterson is talking," Nathan said when he reached them. He kept his voice low, one eye on the conference room doors. "My associate reached him 20 minutes ago. He hasn't been contacted by Hargrove's people yet. He's frightened, and he doesn't have a lawyer." "What did he say?" Olivia asked. "Enough. He confirmed that Hargrove approached him 8 months ago, offered him a significant payment in exchange for creating the technical infrastructure for the credential replication. Patterson has technical skills, but no legal background. He didn't fully understand what he was agreeing to until the transfers happened last night." Nathan paused. "He's not a sophisticated actor. He's a person who made a very bad decision for money and is now realizing that ignorance of the scheme's full scope doesn't protect him from the legal consequences of participating in it." "He'll cooperate?" Ryan asked. "He'll cooperate completely. He wants an agreement in place before he talks to anyone else." Nathan looked at Olivia. "With his testimony and the Meridian thread, we don't need to hold anything back in that boardroom. We have enough." She absorbed that. The board meeting that she had walked into 40 minutes ago as the defendant had turned, gradually and then all at once, into something else entirely. "Then let's finish it," she said. "Oops." The second half of the board meeting lasted 37 minutes. Nathan presented the Meridian thread in full. the project workspace titled Q4 Infrastructure Review. The 6 participants, the 8 months of communication documenting the plan in specific, unmistakable detail. He walked through the payout structure. Hargrove and Whitfield would receive equity stakes in the restructured Arcturus under Vantage Meridian Capital's ownership, calculated as a percentage of the acquisition price. The acquisition price was predicated on Olivia's removal for cause, which would trigger the stock dilution clause and allow a hostile takeover at a fraction of the company's actual value. He read one line from the Meridian thread aloud, a message from Hargrove to Whitfield, sent 6 weeks ago. The authorization architecture will work. Patterson confirmed the bridge between legacy and current. We move on the timeline we discussed. He read it once, clearly, and set the transcript down. Nobody in the room said anything for a full 5 seconds. Carol Brennan had stopped taking notes. She was looking at Daniel Hargrove with an expression that had nothing professional left in it. Just the raw, poorly concealed reaction of someone who has just understood that they were sitting at a table with a person they badly misjudged. Hargrove looked at the table. He looked like what he was, someone who had built a careful structure over a long time and was watching it come apart all at once, and who had not quite prepared himself for what that would feel like in a room full of witnesses. James Whitfield looked worse. He'd gone the color of old paper, and his hands were in his lap where nobody could see whether they were steady. Franklin Cross looked at Garrett Fossey. Fossey was looking at his notes with the expression of a man who was mentally separating his legal obligations from his personal ones and making sure everyone in the room understood that he hadn't known about any of this. "I think," Franklin Cross said, with the careful steadiness of a man speaking around a situation he hadn't expected, "that we need to suspend this meeting pending independent legal review of the evidence just presented." "Before we suspend," Nathan said, "I want to address the shareholder vote that was scheduled for this afternoon. Given the evidence presented, any vote on Ms. Bennett's position would be made under materially false pretenses. I'm advising my client to formally request a postponement of that vote pending independent investigation." "Agreed," Franklin said without hesitation, which told her he was already calculating where he stood relative to this disaster and had decided that aligning with the investigation was his least damaging option. "Furthermore," Nathan continued, "I'm notifying this board that Patterson has agreed to cooperate with investigators. The SEC will be notified of a potential securities fraud situation involving an external investment group and board-level coordination. That notification will go out this afternoon." He looked around the table. "I wanted the board to have that information before it becomes public." The words SEC and securities fraud did what those words always do in a room full of people with financial interests. They landed like something physical, changing the air pressure slightly, making everyone's posture shift. James Whitfield stood up. I need to consult with my personal counsel before." "Sit down, James," Franklin Cross said. His voice was tired. Whitfield sat. Hargrove still hadn't spoken. He was sitting in the same position he'd been in since Nathan began the second presentation, very still, hands flat on the table, looking at a specific point on the table's surface that didn't contain anything. He looked, Olivia thought, like a man doing arithmetic in his head, calculating what he had versus what they had, looking for the gap, finding that the gap was not large enough. She had known him for 11 years. She had trusted him with things she hadn't trusted anyone else. She had looked at him across tables and conference rooms and bad quarterly results and the specific exhaustion of a company in trouble. And she had believed, genuinely believed, that his investment in Arcturus was the same as hers, that he wanted what she wanted because they had built it together. She did not feel what she had expected to feel, looking at him now. She had expected rage or grief, or some version of the cold fury that had gotten her through hard situations before. What she actually felt was more complicated and quieter than those things. Something that lived closer to the place where you finally understand a mistake you made a long time ago. Not about him, about herself. About the way she had confused duration for loyalty and proximity for trust and never noticed the difference. She looked away from him and looked at Franklin Cross. "I want to be clear about something," she said. "I'm not asking for an apology from this board. I'm not asking for acknowledgement that this was handled badly. What I'm asking for is the space to do my job while the investigation proceeds. Arcturus has 1,200 employees. They need to know this company is stable. That requires me to be in my seat. Franklin Cross looked at her for a long moment. I don't think anyone in this room is in a position to argue against that request, he said. Carol Brennan looked up from where she'd been staring at the Meridian transcript. I move to formally table all personnel actions pending independent investigation, she said, and to issue an internal communication to Arcturus staff confirming leadership continuity. She paused. All in favor? 6 hands went up, including Franklin's, not including Whitfield's, whose hand stayed in his lap, and Hargrove's, which stayed on the table, and the outside lawyers, who weren't voting members. Motion carries, Carol said, and wrote something on her legal pad. They walked out of the boardroom at 11:02 a.m. The hallway was the same hallway it had been 2 hours ago, but it felt different, emptier in some way, or cleaner, as if something that had been in the air had been removed. Olivia walked to the elevator and pressed the down button and stood there with her arms at her sides and her folder under her arm, and she did not feel triumphant. She felt the specific, hollow exhaustion of someone who has been braced for an impact for so long that the absence of it doesn't immediately register as good. Nathan was beside her, already typing on his phone. Ryan was a step behind, which was a habit she had noticed. He kept a slight distance, not from discomfort, but from a kind of respect for the space a situation required. He wasn't someone who filled silences with himself. It was a quality she was beginning to understand was rarer than it should be. Hargrove will have counsel by this afternoon, Nathan said without looking up from his phone. They'll argue the Meridian evidence was improperly obtained. We'll counter with the Patterson Cooperation Agreement. It's going to be a process. How long? The investigation? 6 to 8 weeks minimum before any charges. Legal proceedings after that. It could be 18 months. He looked up. You should prepare for this to be in the news. The financial wire services already have partial information. When the SEC involvement becomes public, it's going to get significant coverage. I know. Your communications team will need to be ahead of it. I'll handle that this afternoon. She thought briefly of Diane, the communications director who had told her at 5 in the morning to think about what was best for the company. She was going to need a different communications director. Nathan, how confident are you in the case? He considered this with the precision she'd come to expect from him. The evidence is strong. The Patterson cooperation is significant. The Meridian thread is documented and verifiable. There are unknowns. There always are. But based on what we have, I'm confident. He paused. I'm also realistic. Hargrove's attorneys are going to be expensive and experienced, and they will fight every piece of this. Don't expect a quick resolution. I'm not expecting anything quick, she said. The elevator arrived. Nathan stepped in, still on his phone. She started to follow. I'll catch the next one, Ryan said. She paused, half inside the elevator. Nathan looked up briefly and then back at his phone. She stepped back out and let the doors close. Just her and Ryan in the hallway, the city visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the far end, the mid-morning light flat and gray. You could have ridden down, she said. I know. He looked out at the city. How are you doing? She thought about that honestly, the way she'd been trying to do more of the past several hours. I don't know yet, she said. I think I'm still in the part where I'm running on the chemicals that get you through the crisis. The rest of it will probably arrive later. It does, he said. Takes longer than you think. She looked at him. You've been through something like this. Not like this exactly. He was quiet for a moment. When Claire died, my wife, I didn't feel it for about 3 days. I was making arrangements, handling the logistics, calling people, doing all the things that need doing, and then on the 4th day I sat down on the kitchen floor and couldn't get up for a while. He said it without self-pity, just accurately. The body saves the hard part for when you can finally afford to feel it. She stood with that. What got you up off the kitchen floor? Sophie walked in, he said. She was 5. She climbed into my lap without saying anything, and she fell asleep. He paused. You can't stay on the floor when someone needs you to be vertical. She didn't say anything. She was thinking about what it must have cost him to be vertical, all the time since then. All the mornings and bedtimes and school drop-offs and granola bars eaten alone in basement maintenance rooms in the middle of the night. The sustained, unremarkable effort of being what someone else needed without anyone seeing the weight of it. "She's lucky to have you," Olivia said. "I'm luckier," he said. No self-consciousness in it, just the flat, certain statement of someone who knew exactly what they were saying. The elevator returned. Neither of them moved immediately. "I want to take you and Sophie to dinner," Olivia said. "Not as a thank you, just—" She paused. "I'd like to know her, if that's okay." He looked at her steadily. Something in his face was weighing the offer. Not suspiciously, but carefully, the way he weighed everything. He was a man who'd learned to be careful about the things that mattered. "She'll want to talk about piano," he said. "I look forward to it. She'll also want to tell you that her piano is broken, and her hands are broken, and the song is too hard. I'll tell her to play it for 40 minutes until she gets it right." The corner of his mouth moved. "She'll argue with you about it." "Good," Olivia said. "I like people who argue." He looked at her for a moment more. Then he pressed the elevator button. "Let me know how the SEC call goes," he said. "You'll be the first call I make," she said. She went back to her office alone and sat behind her glass desk, the one she'd never liked but had kept because it looked serious in photographs. And she sat there for a moment without doing anything, which was not something she was good at. The city was out there behind the windows, going about its business, 1,200 employees somewhere in this building doing the same. The company existed. She still had a company. Her phone was full of messages she hadn't read. She would read them. She would make the calls she needed to make, set the communication strategy, talk to department heads, deal with the 17 things that were waiting for her on the other side of the night she'd just survived. She would do all of it, and she would do it with the specific focus that had always been her most reliable quality. But first she sat for a moment, and she allowed herself to feel, in the privacy of her own office, with the door closed and no one watching, the full weight of the last 18 hours. The terror of the transaction screen at 11:47 p.m. The cold of three people's silence at 5 in the morning, the boardroom, and Hargrove's hands flat on the table, and Ryan Carter leaning his mop against her office wall at midnight and saying we should start now, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. She thought about what Nathan had said about the investigation taking 18 months. She thought about 18 months of legal proceedings, of news coverage, of Hargrove's expensive lawyers looking for every angle in the evidence. She thought about the company in the middle of all of it, and the people who depended on it, and the culture she had built, or thought she had built, and what it had apparently allowed to grow in the spaces she hadn't been looking. She thought about that for a long time, about what she hadn't been looking at, about the maintenance worker who had been seeing things she'd missed for 3 weeks before they became catastrophic, and whose reports had been dismissed by a man on a payroll, and who had stayed anyway. Not because she'd asked him to, not because anyone had told him to, but because he'd looked at a situation that wasn't his problem and decided it was. She thought about what kind of company she was running, that the most honest person in it last night had been invisible to her until midnight. That thought sat with her in the particular way of things that are going to stay with you. She didn't push it away. Eventually, she picked up her phone and started making calls, and the work began again. But something had shifted underneath the work. Something in the foundation of how she understood what the work was for and who it was supposed to serve. She couldn't have articulated it precisely, not yet. It was too new, and she was too tired, and the thing that had cracked open last night was still in the process of becoming something else. She would figure out what it was becoming. She was good at figuring things out when she was willing to look. 3 floors below, in the building's maintenance office, Ryan Carter signed out of his shift log at 11:47 a.m., exactly 12 hours since Olivia had first seen the wrong number on her screen, and picked up his jacket and his folder and walked out to his car to go pick up his daughter from school. He didn't think of it as saving anyone. He had found a problem, and he had the tools to address it, and he had decided that was sufficient reason to try. That was the way he worked. He drove with the radio off and thought about Sophie's piano lesson that evening, and whether she'd gotten any further with the left hand, and whether he should stop for the good pasta she liked on the way home. He was almost at the school when his phone buzzed on the passenger seat. A text from an unknown number, followed immediately by a name in the message. "It's Olivia. Nathan says the SEC notification went out. It's starting. Thank you. Oh. He read it at a red light. He thought about what to say back and was still thinking about it when the light changed and a car behind him honked, and he set the phone down and drove the last 2 blocks to the school. Sophie came out the front doors 3 minutes later in her blue coat with the broken zipper they kept meaning to get fixed, backpack bouncing, already talking to a friend beside her, and she spotted his car and waved with her whole arm the way she always did. The specific, unselfconscious wave of a child who has not yet learned to be casual about the people she's glad to see. He got out of the car. She ran the last 20 feet. Dad, you know what happened in math today? What happened in math today? Mrs. Harmon gave us a test, and I finished first, and she said I could read, but I didn't have my book, so I just sat there. Next time, bring your book. I didn't know there'd be a test. There's always a test, he said, and opened the car door for her, and she climbed in, still talking, and he walked around to the driver's side, and before he got in, he stood there for a second with his hand on the roof of the car and looked up at the gray winter sky. Then he got in. His daughter was telling him about the math test in the animated, slightly breathless way of someone who has been saving a story all day. And he listened, and he drove home, and it was enough. The SEC notification went public at 2:17 p.m. Olivia knew it was coming. Nathan had told her it would happen that afternoon, had walked her through the language of the disclosure, had explained in careful detail what it would and wouldn't say. She had prepared a company-wide communication, drafted with the help of a crisis communications consultant she'd called at noon, a woman named Patricia Sung, who came recommended by 3 different people in Olivia's network, and who had arrived at the office by 1 p.m. with a yellow legal pad and the specific brisk efficiency of someone who had handled worse. They had worked through the language together for 40 minutes, going back and forth on every sentence until it said exactly what it needed to say and nothing it shouldn't. She sent the internal communication at 2:05 p.m. 12 minutes later, the financial wire services picked up the SEC disclosure. By 3 p.m., her phone had received 147 messages. She had read 11 of them. The 11 she read were from department heads, people with direct operational responsibilities, people who needed to know what the next 24 hours looked like so they could make decisions. She responded to each of them personally, briefly, with the specific information they needed and nothing extra. She kept her language measured and her tone steady, the way you speak when you need the people around you to believe the ship is still moving in the right direction even when the water is rough. The other 136 messages she handed to Patricia, who sorted them into categories with the practiced ease of someone who had done this kind of triage before. Media inquiries, investor concerns, board-adjacent communications that Nathan needed to see, personal messages from people who wanted to offer support, or in a few cases, get in front of what was coming. At 3:45 p.m., Olivia looked up from her desk and realized she hadn't eaten since. She couldn't remember since when. There was a granola bar on the corner of her desk that someone had left there, and she looked at it and thought of Ryan's half-eaten one in the maintenance room that morning, and ate it without tasting it and kept working. The afternoon was the specific kind of brutal that doesn't announce itself dramatically. No single thing that happened between 3 p.m. and 8 p.m. was catastrophic. It was the accumulated weight of 100 small urgent things, each one manageable on its own, collectively exhausting in the way of running uphill for a long time. 2 major clients called with concerns about their contracts. She took both calls herself, spoke clearly about the company's stability, made no promises she couldn't keep, and retained both clients with the cautious, provisional loyalty of people who needed to believe things were going to be all right and were willing to extend a short-term credit of trust. The company's stock had dropped 11% on the news of the SEC investigation. She watched the number and absorbed it and did not allow it to change her voice or her posture because the number would do what numbers do, move based on information and sentiment and forces she couldn't control from her desk. And what she could control was whether Arcturus looked like a company in freefall or a company navigating a defined problem with leadership intact. She worked at looking like the second one. At 8:15 p.m., Patricia knocked and came in. "You should go home," she said. Not a suggestion, the tone of someone who had dealt with enough executives in crisis to know that the ones who ran themselves into the ground in the first week made worse decisions in the second week. "I'll leave at 9, Olivia said. "You said 9 an hour ago?" "I meant 9 this time." Patricia looked at her for a moment. She was in her late 40s, with short, gray-streaked hair and reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the expression of someone who had developed, over many years, a highly calibrated tolerance for exactly this kind of response. "The statement for tomorrow morning is drafted. Nathan has reviewed it. The department head briefing is scheduled for 8 a.m. There's nothing on your desk right now that cannot wait until 7 tomorrow morning." She paused. "You've been awake for approximately 40 hours. The decisions you make in this state are not your best decisions." Olivia started to say something and stopped. The stopping was itself an acknowledgement. She was tired enough that she'd caught herself about to argue with someone who was simply right. 9, she said again, but with less conviction. 8:30, Patricia said, and walked out. She left at 8:40. Close enough. The investigation that Nathan had estimated at 6 to 8 weeks took 9. Olivia had expected this. Nathan had warned her that the timeline was optimistic. He'd said 6 to 8 the way doctors say 3 to 6 months, building in buffer without wanting to demoralize the patient. The 9 weeks were not evenly difficult. There were periods that felt almost normal, stretches of several days where the company ran, the work happened. The ordinary machinery of 1,200 people doing their jobs occupied most of her attention. She hired a new head of communications and promoted 2 department heads who had demonstrated during the crisis that they were people who showed up more clearly under pressure. She restructured the CFO's office, installing an interim CFO from outside, a careful, slightly dry woman named Elaine Chu who had no relationship with anyone on the board and no appetite for drama and who turned out to be excellent. There were also periods that were very hard. The weeks when Hargrove's legal team was most active were the worst. They filed motions against the admissibility of the Meridian evidence, challenged the chain of custody documentation Ryan had created, argued that Patterson's cooperation agreement had been obtained under duress. Each motion required a response, and each response required time and attention and the particular mental cost of re-engaging with the same ground you thought you'd already covered. Nathan handled the legal arguments with the same unhurried precision he'd brought to the boardroom on that first morning. He won 2 of the 3 motions outright. The third, the challenge to the Meridian evidence, was partially upheld by the reviewing judge, which meant a subset of the communications had to be excluded. It was a setback, but not a fatal one. Patterson's testimony filled the gap that the excluded evidence left. And Patterson was a more compelling witness than a document thread anyway. A real person, sitting in front of investigators, explaining in specific detail what he had been asked to do and by whom and for how much. Patterson had been paid $180,000. Olivia learned this in Nathan's debrief after the 3rd week of investigation, and she sat with that number for a moment. $180,000 to help dismantle something that had taken 11 years to build. She didn't say what she was thinking, which was that she didn't know what a person's complicity cost. Whether $180,000 was a lot or a little for the thing Patterson had agreed to do. Ryan testified in the 5th week. She had offered to go with him, and he had said he'd be fine. And she had gone anyway and waited in the hallway outside the federal building because she wanted to. He was in the room for 3 hours. When he came out, he looked like someone who had given a great deal of careful attention to a difficult task and was now done with it and wanted coffee. "How was it?" she asked. "Fine," he said. They asked good questions, clear. "Were Hargrove's lawyers difficult?" "They tried." He glanced at her sideways. "I've testified before, in different contexts. The technique is the same. They look for the place where your certainty has a crack in it, and they try to widen it. It doesn't work if your certainty is based on documentation and method rather than memory." "Is yours?" "Always," he said. "I learned a long time ago to document everything. Memory is fallible. Paper isn't." She had brought coffee. She handed him the cup and they walked to a bench outside the federal building and sat there for a while. And the city did its afternoon thing around them, and neither of them felt the need to fill the silence with a summary of what had just happened. "Sophie has a piano recital in 2 weeks, he said eventually. "I know," Olivia said. "She told me about it on Thursday." He looked at her. "You talked to Sophie on Thursday?" She called to tell me she finally got the left hand and right hand working at the same time. She wanted me to know. He looked like he wasn't sure whether to laugh or say something more significant. She called you. She has my number. You gave it to her. I gave it to her for emergencies. She felt this was an emergency, Olivia said. She needed to tell someone who would understand how significant the left-hand breakthrough was. He shook his head slowly, but the expression on his face was the good kind. She talks about you, he said. More than I expected. Is that okay? He thought about it honestly. Yeah, he said. It's okay. He paused. She doesn't have a lot of women she talks to. Her grandmother tries, but they're from different planets, those two. Claire's sister comes around, but it's complicated. He was quiet for a moment. Sophie gravitates toward people who take her seriously. She can tell pretty fast if someone's talking to her the way adults talk to children. The performed interest thing. She doesn't like it. I don't do that, Olivia said. I know you don't, he said. That's why she calls you. The dinner she had promised happened in the 6th week, on a Saturday evening in mid-January when the city was cold enough to mean it. She had suggested a restaurant, a good one, the kind she'd normally choose, and Ryan had said Sophie would be more comfortable somewhere she knew, somewhere that wasn't formal, so they ended up at a small Italian place 2 blocks from his apartment in Crown Heights, a neighborhood place with paper tablecloths and the kind of menu that didn't have pictures but whose pasta portions were large enough to make the point regardless. Sophie was 8 years old and approximately as advertised, small and specific and possessed of a seriousness beneath the energy that reminded Olivia, in a disorienting way, of herself at an age she barely remembered. She wore a green sweater and her hair in 2 uneven braids that had the look of being self-administered, and she slid into the booth seat and immediately began arranging the sugar packets by color, which seemed to be less a game and more a basic organizational need. Dad says you're a CEO, Sophie said, without looking up from the sugar packets. What does that mean you do? It means I'm in charge of a company. What kind of company? Technology, software mostly. Sophie looked up. Do you make games? No, more like tools that businesses use. Sophie considered this. That sounds boring. Sophie, Ryan said. It's okay, Olivia said and meant it. Honestly, some of it is boring. The interesting part is building something from nothing. When I started, it was just me and one other person in a garage. A real garage? A real garage. We had 1 table and 2 chairs and a coffee maker that only worked half the time. Sophie seemed to find this more interesting than the software. Did you live in the garage? No, I had an apartment, but I was in the garage more than the apartment. Why? Because the work needed doing. Sophie arranged the last sugar packet and looked at the completed rows with satisfaction, then looked back at Olivia. My dad works nights, she said, so I stay at Grandma's, but he's always home before I wake up. I know, Olivia said. He doesn't have to do that, Sophie said. The night thing. He could do something in the day. She said it without accusation, just factually, a child reporting a situation she'd clearly thought about. He does it because the hours work better, for us. Olivia looked at Ryan, who was looking at his menu with the practiced expression of a man who had decided not to intervene in this particular conversation. Your dad is smart about that, Olivia said, choosing work that fits around what actually matters. He's smart about most things, Sophie said, with the casual certainty of someone who had never doubted this. He knew something was wrong with my school last year before my teacher even told him. He said the schedule changes didn't make sense. He's good at noticing patterns, Olivia said. What's a pattern? It's when things happen in a way that repeats, or should repeat but doesn't. Your dad is very good at seeing when something is off in a system. Sophie thought about this. Like with my piano, she said, when the rhythm is wrong. Exactly like that. Sophie seemed satisfied with this equivalence. She picked up her menu. I'm getting the spaghetti, she said. I always get the spaghetti here. It's the best thing. I'll get the same, Olivia said. Sophie looked at her appraisingly. You don't have to get it just because I am. I'm not. I like spaghetti. A beat. Sophie seemed to decide this was acceptable. She went back to her menu, and Ryan looked up from his, and something moved between him and Olivia. The brief, quiet communication of two adults who have just navigated something successfully, with the specific relief of having not made it awkward. The spaghetti was very good. Sophie talked throughout most of dinner, about school, about a disagreement with a friend named Ava over a library book, about the piano recital and the piece she was preparing, which she described as not that hard anymore, actually, with the retrospective confidence of someone who had revised their opinion upward after mastering something difficult. She asked Olivia questions directly and without preamble, in the way of children who have not yet learned to perform social niceties, asked her about the garage and the coffee maker, about whether she had siblings, about what she ate for breakfast, and whether she liked dogs. Olivia answered everything honestly. She did not have siblings. She ate yogurt most mornings, which Sophie found insufficient. She liked dogs, but had never had one because of the hours she kept. "You should get one," Sophie said. "Dogs need more time than I've been giving things," Olivia said. Sophie looked at her seriously. "My dad says time is the thing you have to decide about. You can't make more of it. You just decide where it goes." Ryan looked up from his plate. "I don't think I said it that elegantly." "You said it when I wanted to keep watching TV and you said no," Sophie told him. "You said you can't make more hours. You have to pick." "That's essentially the same thing," Olivia said to Ryan. "She edits me for clarity," he said. "She's good at it," Olivia said. Sophie had gone back to her spaghetti, apparently satisfied that this point had been made, and the conversation moved on, and the evening moved on, and somewhere in the middle of it, Olivia stopped noticing the restaurant's decor or the background noise or any of the peripheral information she usually tracked automatically. She was just there, at a paper tablecloth table with a man who made decisions based on what actually mattered, and his 8-year-old daughter who sorted sugar packets and was learning to play piano and edited her father for clarity. She could not remember the last time she had been somewhere without part of her brain remaining in the office. It was strange, and also, she was surprised to find, not unwelcome. 2. The investigation concluded formally in the 9th week, with charges filed against Hargrove on 4 counts of securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy. Whitfield was charged on 2 counts, lesser involvement, but present and documented. The managing partner of Vantage Meridian Capital received the most serious charges of the 3, given that the investment group had been the originating financial beneficiary of the scheme. Patterson cooperated fully and received a reduced charge in exchange. Nathan had negotiated this outcome with the precision Olivia had come to expect from him, and while she didn't feel warmth toward Patterson, she understood the calculus. His testimony had been essential. The day the charges were announced, Nathan called her at 9 a.m. "It's done," he said, meaning the investigation phase was complete. What came next was the legal proceedings, which were a different animal, slower, more procedural, less in her direct control. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "The trial will be its own process." "I know, but thank you for this part." A pause. Nathan was not a warm man by nature, but there was something genuine in his voice when he said, "You handled this correctly. A lot of people in your situation would have made mistakes. You didn't." She thought about what handling it correctly had required. The 4 a.m. phone calls. Ryan's mop leaned against her office wall. Sophie sorting sugar packets by color. The 9 weeks of showing up and making the next decision, and not letting the hard thing in front of her become an excuse to stop looking at the harder things beneath it. "I had good people," she said. "You did," Nathan agreed. She called Ryan next. He picked up on the second ring. She could hear in the background the sound of something being assembled, a metallic, systematic sound. She pictured him in the maintenance room, or in his apartment, which she had been to once to pick up Sophie for a museum visit, and which was the apartment of someone who kept things functional and orderly without caring much about aesthetics. "Charges filed," she said. "All 3 of them. Hargrove, Whitfield, and Brennan from Vantage." A pause. "Good," he said. "Nathan says the trial phase will take another year minimum." "That's about right." "I wanted you to hear it from me first." Another pause, shorter. "I appreciate that." The metallic sound in the background stopped. "How are you feeling?" She considered the question. She was getting better at considering it rather than deflecting it. "Relieved," she said, "and tired. And like there are things I should have been paying more attention to for a long time. That's a lot of feelings for 9 in the morning. I'm efficient, she said. He laughed. A short, real laugh, the kind she'd learned to listen for because he didn't produce them for effect. Sophie wants to know if you're coming to the recital on Friday, he said. I already told her I'm coming. She confirmed it 3 times over text. She's making sure. I told her I'd be there. She wants to make sure you mean it, Ryan said, without judgment in it. Just explaining Sophie's particular way of trusting things, the repeated confirmation, the not wanting to be surprised, a child who had learned early that some commitments don't hold the way they're supposed to. I mean it, Olivia said. I know, he said. I'll tell her. The recital was on a Friday evening in a school auditorium in Crown Heights that smelled of floor wax and old folding chairs. Olivia arrived 10 minutes early and sat in the 3rd row, which Sophie had specified via text. 3rd row because Dad says front row is embarrassing, but I want you to be able to see. She sat with her coat in her lap and her phone on silent, and looked at the low stage with its upright piano, badly tuned from the sound of the warm-up notes she could hear from backstage, and felt something she didn't immediately have a name for. Ryan arrived 2 minutes before the program started, slightly out of breath, and slid into the seat she'd saved beside her. Sorry, work ran over. You're here, she said. I'm always here for this, he said. And the specific way he said it, not defensively, just as a statement of how things were, told her that this was not a thing that had ever been in question for him, through everything, through the night shifts and the court testimony and the 9 weeks of investigation. He was always here for this. Sophie came out 8th in the program. She walked to the piano bench with the studied composure of an 8-year-old, trying very hard not to look like she was trying hard, sat down, adjusted the bench twice. The second time unnecessarily, Olivia thought. But Sophie seemed to need it, and then put her hands on the keys. She played a piece Olivia didn't know, something classical and moderate in tempo, and she played it with the fierce, slightly rigid concentration of someone for whom the technical elements were still requiring active attention rather than automatic execution. She missed a note in the second section, caught it, recovered, kept going. Her left hand and right hand were, as advertised, working at the same time. Not perfectly, but working. When she finished, she looked up and found her father in the 3rd row, and then found Olivia, and the expression on her face was the specific expression of a child who has just done a hard thing in front of people and needs confirmation that it was enough. Ryan put both hands up, a quiet, private gesture, not applause, just yes. Yes, it was enough. Sophie looked at Olivia. Olivia nodded once and put her hand over her heart briefly, and meant it. Sophie's face broke open in a grin that she immediately tried to contain because they were still in the auditorium and she was supposed to walk off the stage with composure, and she mostly managed it, and then she was gone behind the curtain and Ryan exhaled beside her. She's been nervous about this for 2 weeks, he said. She played it well, Olivia said. She's going to say she made a mistake. She recovered from it perfectly. I know, she won't care. She'll focus on the mistake. I'll tell her what I told her about the 40 minutes of practice, Olivia said. That's not a mistake. That's a data point. Ryan looked at her sideways. You're going to give my 8-year-old a data point speech. I'm going to tell her that recovering from something hard is more impressive than not making a mistake in the first place. Because it is. She paused. I say this as someone who spent the last 9 weeks recovering from something hard. He was quiet for a moment. Around them, other parents were clapping for the next child at the piano. How is that going? He said. The recovering? She thought about it honestly. Some days better than others. I still wake up some mornings and the first thing I think about is the night it happened. The number on the screen. I still have moments in board meetings where I look around the table and I'm calculating trust instead of just being in the room. She paused. But the company is running well. The people I kept are the right people. And I'm paying attention to different things than I was before. Like what? Like who actually shows up when it matters. Like whether the people around me are building something or just benefiting from something that's already built. Like, she stopped. Like what's happening in the maintenance room. He looked at her. I mean that literally, she said. I've been walking the building, talking to people, the overnight crew, the facilities team, the people in roles I never looked at. She paused. I didn't know the names of the people who kept my building running. That's not a small failure of management. That's a failure of basic understanding of what a company actually is. Ryan was quiet for a moment. People notice when the person at the top actually sees them, he said, not in a theatrical way, just when it's real. I know that now, she said. Did you not know it before? She thought about that honestly. I knew it the way you know things you've read, she said. I didn't know it the way you know things that have happened to you. He nodded, not absolving her of the gap, not amplifying it either, just acknowledging it. She had noticed that about him, the way he received difficult admissions without either dismissing them or using them as evidence of something. He just let them be what they were. Sophie appeared from the side door of the auditorium, still in her recital dress, and threaded her way through the rows of chairs toward them. She reached them and stood with her hands clasped in front of her. I made a mistake, she said. You recovered beautifully, Olivia said. I still made a mistake. Sophie, the note you missed was in the second section. You found your place again in less than 2 beats. Most of the people in this room didn't notice. Sophie considered this. Did you notice? Yes, Olivia said, and I'm telling you it didn't matter. Because what I noticed more was that you didn't stop. You made a mistake and you kept going. Sophie looked at her with the expression of someone receiving information they're not fully sure they believe but are considering. Dad said the same thing, she said. Your dad is right. Sophie looked at her father. You're both saying the same thing. That's because it's true, Ryan said. Sophie made the expression of someone experiencing mild skepticism but lacking sufficient counter-evidence to argue further. Can we get hot chocolate? She said. Yes, Ryan said. The place on Fulton? Wherever you want. Sophie looked at Olivia. You're coming, right? I'm coming, Olivia said. They walked out of the school auditorium into the Friday evening, the 3 of them, Sophie between them, still in her recital dress with her coat over it, talking about the hot chocolate place and whether they still had the cinnamon one, and Ryan listening and occasionally responding, and Olivia walking on the other side of Sophie and listening too. The street was cold in the specific way of a January night in Brooklyn, the kind of cold that was just weather rather than something dramatic. And the city was doing what it always did on Friday evenings, moving and lit and indifferent in the comfortable way of a place that contains so many things happening at once that any one thing can belong without needing to announce itself. Olivia thought about her apartment, which she had finally started furnishing. She thought about the board meeting she had on Monday, which she was ready for. She thought about Elaine Chu, the interim CFO, who she was considering making permanent. She thought about Hargrove, somewhere out there in the process of a legal defense that was going to consume the next year of his life, and she found that she didn't feel very much about it. Not satisfaction, not ongoing anger, just the quiet acknowledgement of a consequence meeting an action, the ledger balancing. She thought about what she had told Ryan, about paying attention to different things. It wasn't a transformation. She hadn't become a different person in 9 weeks. She was still the person who worked too long and forgot to buy furniture and converted fear into momentum and had a hard time letting people in without cataloging what they wanted from her. She was still all of those things. But she was starting to understand the difference between the work you do because you're building something real and the work you do because you don't know what else to do with yourself. And she was starting to understand slowly and with the particular difficulty of someone learning something that requires unlearning something else first, that the real things were smaller than she'd thought and more specific. A recital in a school auditorium that smelled of floor wax, a girl who sorted sugar packets by color, a man who had stayed up all night for the right reason and gone home to his daughter in the morning. It's the cinnamon one, Sophie announced, with the authority of someone who had just made a decision. I'm definitely getting the cinnamon one. You always get the cinnamon one, Ryan said. Because it's the best one. Then why do you say you're deciding? Sophie looked up at him with the expression of someone encountering a very obvious logical failure. Because I'm allowed to change my mind, she said. I'm just choosing not to. Ryan caught Olivia's eye over Sophie's head. The look on his face was the one she'd come to recognize, the specific expression of a father who is, in a particular moment, slightly undone by his own child in the best way. Olivia smiled, not the professional kind she wore in boardrooms and on investor calls. The other kind, the one she was still getting used to the feeling of. They walked on down the street toward the hot chocolate place on Fulton, and the cold was just cold, and the city was just the city, and nothing about any of it was remarkable except that it was, in the plainest and most sturdy sense of the word, real. The trial began on a Tuesday in March, 14 months after the night Olivia had stared at the wrong number on her screen and felt the floor disappear. She had been in courtrooms before. Depositions, contract disputes, the occasional intellectual property skirmish that came with operating in the technology sector. She knew the procedural rhythms, the particular quality of time inside a courtroom, the way everything moved slower than it should and faster than you were ready for. She was not unprepared. But there is a difference between being in a courtroom because of a business dispute and being in one because someone you trusted for 11 years decided you were a more useful obstacle than a person. The procedural rhythms were the same. The quality of sitting inside them was entirely different. Hargrove's legal team was exactly what Nathan had predicted: expensive, experienced, and committed to the strategy of making the evidence seem less certain than it was. They had spent 14 months looking for cracks in the chain of custody documentation, in Patterson's testimony, in Ryan's technical account of what he'd found and how he'd found it. They had filed 11 motions in the pre-trial period. They had won 3 of them, which was fewer than they'd hoped for and more than Olivia had wanted. The 3 wins had excluded 2 of the Meridian thread communications from the trial record, not the most damaging ones, but enough to create a gap that Hargrove's lead attorney, a tall woman named Cecilia Marsh, who had been doing this for 25 years, would attempt to stand in and expand. "She's good," Nathan told Olivia on the morning of the first day, in the corridor outside the courtroom. "She's going to present Hargrove as someone who made financially aggressive decisions within the scope of his authority and argue that the conspiracy framing is a narrative Ms. Bennett constructed after the fact to explain her own financial mismanagement." "That's absurd," Olivia said. "It's also coherent," Nathan said, "which is what matters in a courtroom. She doesn't need the jury to believe Hargrove is innocent. She needs them to believe there's enough uncertainty that they can't say he's guilty beyond a reasonable doubt." "And Patterson's testimony?" "She'll attack Patterson's credibility. He accepted money. He cooperated to reduce his own charges. Those are 2 legitimate vulnerabilities." Nathan looked at her. "This is going to be uncomfortable. There are going to be days where it sounds like they're winning. They're not, but it's going to sound that way." She went into the courtroom and sat at the plaintiff's table and looked at the room. The jury box, the judge's bench, the gallery behind her, already filling with journalists and observers and people she didn't recognize who were there for their own reasons. She looked at Hargrove, who sat at the defense table across the room in a charcoal suit she recognized, because she had been present once when he bought it, at a department store on Fifth Avenue after a meeting, 3 years ago. He had asked her opinion. She had said it fit well. He did not look at her. She looked away from him and looked at the jury instead. 12 people who had been selected through a process she'd observed with Nathan's guidance. 12 strangers who would decide, based on what they heard over the next several weeks, what the truth of the previous 2 years actually was. She studied their faces the way she studied faces in meetings, looking for the quality of attention, the particular alertness or blankness that told you something about how information was landing. She made herself stop. This was not a board meeting. She could not read this room and adjust her strategy based on what she saw. Her job here was to sit correctly, to show up every day, to trust Nathan, and to not let what happened in this building become the place where she lived inside her head. That last part was the hardest. Ryan testified on the 8th day of the trial. He had testified in the investigation, which meant he had gone through this particular version of scrutiny once already and knew what it required. He took the stand with the same quality he brought to everything, not calm exactly, but centered, like someone who had located the still point in a complicated situation and was standing on it. Nathan walked him through the technical evidence first, the anomalous network traffic he'd logged for 3 weeks, the script signature on the transactions, the legacy archive access trail. He explained each element in language that was specific enough to be credible and clear enough that a non-technical jury could follow it. He'd done this before, explained technical systems to non-technical audiences, and it showed. He didn't condescend, didn't oversimplify, didn't use jargon as a shield. Then Cecilia Marsh stood up. She was good. Nathan had not overstated that. She started with Patterson, the cooperation agreement, the reduced charges, the question of what a man who had accepted $180,000 to participate in a fraud was worth as a character witness for the prosecution's case. She walked through the argument carefully, threading it without apparent hurry, and Olivia watched the jury and watched two of them making notes, and watched one of them, a man in his 40s in the second seat, nodding slightly at something Marsh said. Then Marsh turned to Ryan. "Mr. Carter," she said, "you testified that you noticed unusual network activity over a period of approximately 3 weeks prior to the night of the alleged fraud. That's correct? And you reported this to the building's IT contractor." "I reported it to Patterson, yes." "And Patterson told you it was routine?" "He told me it was routine maintenance activity." "And you accepted that explanation at the time?" A brief pause. "I logged it and continued observing," Ryan said. "I didn't accept it as a final answer. I noted it as an unexplained element." Marsh tilted her head slightly. "But you didn't escalate beyond Patterson. You didn't go to building management or Arcturus IT directly." "Patterson was my established contact for building network issues." "So you worked within the system," Marsh said, "even though, as you're now testifying, you had concerns." "I had observations. The concerns came later, when the context became clearer." Marsh looked at the jury briefly. "Mr. Carter, you're currently employed as a building maintenance worker." "Yes." "Not as a cybersecurity specialist." "Not currently, no." "You left cybersecurity approximately 5 years ago." "Yes." "A great deal changes in 5 years in that field." Ryan looked at her steadily. "The principles of network forensics don't change as fast as the technologies. What I identified was pattern recognition, anomalies in traffic behavior relative to established baselines. That methodology is stable." Marsh paused. It was the pause of someone who had expected a more vulnerable answer and was recalculating. "You identified these patterns," she said, "and then accessed Arcturus's internal systems, including the Meridian platform, using Ms. Bennett's administrative credentials. Ms. Bennett authorized that access in real time. The authorization is documented in the evidence log. At 1 in the morning, in a private office, without any independent witness. The documentation itself is the record," Ryan said. "That's why I created it." Marsh looked at him for a moment. She was looking for the crack. Nathan had described exactly this, the way a good defense attorney searches for the place where certainty has a seam. She was looking and not finding one, and the jury could see her looking. "You had never met Ms. Bennett before that night," Marsh said. "That's correct." "But you stayed up all night helping her." "I stayed up all night following the evidence where it led." "Out of the goodness of your heart." Ryan looked at her with the expression of someone who has decided not to be provoked by a question dressed as a compliment. "Out of the understanding that someone was being framed," he said, "and that I had the tools to demonstrate it. And it didn't occur to you that Ms. Bennett might be using your technical skills to construct a defense rather than document a truth." The courtroom was very quiet. "Ms. Marsh," Ryan said, "the evidence I documented either exists or it doesn't. The access logs either show what they show or they don't. The Meridian thread either contains what it contains or it doesn't. I'm not the author of any of that evidence. I'm the person who found it and recorded finding it correctly. Whether Ms. Bennett was using me or trusting me doesn't change what the data says." Marsh held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked down at her notes. "No further questions," she said. In the gallery, Olivia breathed. The verdict came on the 19th day of testimony after 3 days of deliberation that Olivia experienced with the specific quality of someone who has been told to wait for something they can't affect and who is constitutionally unsuited to waiting. She went to the office both days of deliberation. She worked. She held her scheduled meetings and made her scheduled calls and reviewed the quarterly projections with Elaine Chu, who had by this point officially accepted the permanent CFO role and who had the particular gift of being competent without needing anyone to notice how competent she was. Olivia worked through both deliberation days and went home at reasonable hours and did not sleep well either night, and on the morning of the third deliberation day, she was in her office at 7 when Nathan called. "They have a verdict," he said. She was in the car 20 minutes later. The courtroom was full in a way it hadn't been during testimony. Word of the verdict had moved fast, the way those things do, and the gallery was packed with journalists and observers and people who had been following the case for reasons she understood and reasons she didn't. She sat at the plaintiff's table and looked straight ahead and made herself breathe at a normal rate. Ryan was in the gallery, third row on the left. She had not asked him to come. He had texted that morning, "I'll be there." She had not told him he didn't need to be because he did, and she knew it, and he knew it. The jury filed in. The foreperson, a woman in her 60s who had, throughout the trial, listened with the particular attention of someone who took the responsibility seriously, stood and read the verdict on the first count. Guilty. Second count. Guilty. Third count. Guilty. Fourth count. Guilty. She heard the gallery react, a collective exhale, a murmur, the specific sound of a room in which many people have been waiting for something and have just received it. She heard Hargrove's attorney make a note. She heard, very faintly from somewhere behind her in the gallery, the sound of someone crying, sick. She didn't know who, and she didn't turn around to look. She sat very still and felt the verdict settle into her body, not as triumph, but as something more complicated. The specific feeling of an account that has been out of balance for a long time finally being corrected. Not fixed, corrected. The damage had been real, and the correction didn't undo it. What it did was establish the truth of what had happened in a form that required evidence and deliberation and the judgment of 12 people who had no stake in the outcome. That mattered. She had not been certain, until this moment, how much it would matter to have it said aloud in a room like this, formally, on the record. It mattered more than she'd expected. Whitfield's verdict came the following week. 2 counts, guilty on both. The Vantage Meridian managing partner had already entered a plea agreement 3 weeks earlier, which Nathan had explained was a calculation on his part. He'd seen the Patterson testimony and the Meridian thread, and decided the trial outcome was not in his favor. He would cooperate with regulators and receive a reduced sentence. His firm would be dissolved. The sentences for Hargrove and Whitfield were handed down 6 weeks after the verdict. Hargrove received 7 years. Whitfield received 3 and a suspended sentence tied to cooperation with regulators. Nathan explained that these were within the expected range, which meant they were neither satisfying nor surprising, just the system producing an outcome at the end of a long process. The day the sentences were announced, Olivia sat in her office after the news and did not feel what she expected to feel. She had thought there might be more relief, more resolution, the specific emotional completion that the end of something like this is supposed to provide. What she actually felt was quieter and more diffuse than that. Something like putting down a weight you'd been carrying so long you'd stop noticing it was heavy, and finding that your arms were still slightly raised from the habit of holding it. She called Nathan. She thanked him properly, not with the quick efficiency of professional gratitude, but with the kind that acknowledges what something actually cost. She called Ryan. He picked up on the first ring. "I know," he said. "I saw the news. 7 years," she said. "Yeah." She didn't say anything for a moment. He didn't feel the silence, which was the thing about him that she had come to depend on more than she could have anticipated. His fluency with silence, his understanding that some moments didn't require words to be present in. "You okay?" he said. "I think so." She paused. "I thought I'd feel more." "You feel what you feel," he said. "It doesn't have to be dramatic to be real." Sophie said something like that once, she said. About the piano, that it doesn't have to be perfect to be music. "She's wiser than me," Ryan said. "Don't tell her I said that. She'll use it." Olivia laughed, the short, real kind. "Ryan, thank you for all of it." "You already thanked me." "I'm thanking you again." A pause. "How's the company?" "Good," she said. And then, because it was true and she wanted to say it to someone who would understand what it meant. "Really good. Better than before, in some ways." "Tell me," he said. So she did. Bam. The numbers were real. In the 12 months following the investigation's conclusion, Arcturus Technologies had posted its strongest revenue performance in company history. A 34% increase in annual revenue, three significant enterprise contracts that had been in negotiation for over a year and had finally closed, and an expansion into two new market segments that the company's restructured leadership team had been quietly developing during the months when most of the public attention had been on the legal proceedings. But the numbers were not the part she told Ryan about. The numbers were the result of the other things, and the other things were what she was still figuring out how to talk about, because they were harder to quantify and more important. In the 8 months after the boardroom confrontation, she had done something she had never done systematically before. She had walked the company. Not in the figurative sense that management consultants talk about, the theoretical management by walking around she'd read about in business books and filed away as applicable to other kinds of organizations. She had literally walked every floor, every department, the overnight shift of the facilities team, which she had arranged to visit twice, bringing coffee and sitting for 20 minutes and asking what they needed and what they'd noticed. The customer support floor, where the people who talked to clients every day sat in rows with headsets on and knew things about how customers experienced Arcturus products that never made it into the quarterly reports. What she found was not a revelation in the dramatic sense. It was smaller and more specific than a revelation. It was 100 small things she hadn't known and should have. A process in the customer support workflow that everyone agreed was inefficient, but that nobody had escalated because the escalation pathway was unclear. A team lead in the product division who had been flagging a security concern for 4 months through the wrong channel, which meant it kept landing on a desk where it sat unread. A junior developer who had solved a significant infrastructure problem with an elegant bit of code that his manager hadn't understood well enough to recognize, and which had therefore not been seen by anyone who might have acted on it. She fixed the things that were fixable. She changed the escalation pathways. She created a direct channel for security concerns that went to the CTO and Elaine Chu simultaneously. She promoted the team lead. She found the developer's code, had it reviewed by 3 senior engineers who all confirmed it was genuinely good, and moved it into the production architecture with a formal acknowledgement to the team. These were not grand gestures. They were not the kind of changes that made headlines or warranted a press release. They were the kind of changes that made a company slightly more honest with itself, slightly more connected between the people who saw problems and the people who had the authority to solve them. She also built something she had been thinking about since the night Ryan had told her about Sophie, about choosing work that fit around what actually mattered. She called it the Flexible Architecture Program, which was a name that sounded more technical than it was. It was, in practice, a set of policies designed around the recognition that the people who worked at Arcturus had lives outside Arcturus that were real and important, and that the company's success depended on acknowledging rather than competing with. Flexible scheduling. A parental support structure that went beyond the legal minimum and included actual support. Backup childcare coordination, a parent resource group with a modest operating budget, a formal policy that made clear that the use of flexible scheduling would not be tracked as a signal of insufficient commitment. The HR team had been cautious about it initially. One of them had presented her with data suggesting that flexible scheduling policies in the technology sector were frequently abused and difficult to administer fairly. She had listened to the data, asked questions, and then said, "The problem with the data is that it's measuring for abuse rather than designing for trust. Let's design for trust and measure whether it works." They designed for trust. 6 months in, the voluntary turnover rate had dropped 18%. The employee satisfaction survey, which she had never previously read with any genuine interest, showed a specific increase in the category that asked whether employees felt the company respected their lives outside of work. She read that survey result twice and thought about Ryan in the basement maintenance room, eating a half-eaten granola bar at 1 in the morning, choosing night shifts because the hours fit around the thing that mattered most. She had not made him rich. She had not transformed his life with a dramatic gesture. What she had done, what he had allowed, was bring his work into the visible part of the story. Nathan's formal retention of Ryan as a technical consultant had continued through the legal proceedings and concluded with a fee that Ryan had accepted without drama and used, as he mentioned once in passing, to fix Sophie's piano. The actual instrument, which had in fact developed a mechanical problem in the keys, which Sophie had been correct about all along. She was right, Olivia had said when he mentioned this. She was right, Ryan said. The piano was a little broken, not in the way she meant, but the E-flat above middle C had a stuck hammer. He paused. I got it repaired. She played for 3 hours straight the first night. Did she say she told you so? Repeatedly, he said. On a Wednesday evening in November, 14 months after the verdict and 2 years after the night the Empire cracked, Olivia left the office at 6:15. This was not remarkable anymore. She still worked long hours. That hadn't changed, and she was realistic enough about herself to understand it probably wouldn't, not fully. The work was real and it required her, and she was still someone who converted focus into momentum by nature. But she had learned, with the specific difficulty of someone unlearning a reflex, that leaving at 6:15 was not a surrender. It was a choice, and choices were the things Sophie's father had said you had to make deliberately, because you couldn't make more hours. She took the subway to Crown Heights, which she had started doing on Wednesday evenings. It had begun as a practical arrangement. Sophie's piano lesson ended at 6 on Wednesdays, and Ryan's shift started at 7, and there was a window in between where Sophie needed supervision and dinner and someone to listen to her practice the week's piece before Ryan had to leave. Olivia had offered, once, and then it had simply continued, the way things do when nobody decides to stop them. She let herself into Ryan's apartment with the key he'd given her 3 months earlier. When it had become apparent that she was there often enough for the alternative, Sophie waiting in the hallway, to be absurd. The apartment was the same as it had always been, functional, slightly cluttered in the lived-in way of a place where an 8-year-old's activities occupied significant square footage. There were piano books on the coffee table. A drawing Sophie had done of something that might have been a horse or a large dog was taped to the refrigerator beside a spelling test with a gold star on it. Sophie was at the piano when Olivia came in, playing through the week's piece with the intense, slightly frowning concentration she always brought to practice. She looked up when Olivia entered, finished the phrase she was on before stopping, which she had not done in the early months, when she would stop mid-phrase to say hello, and which Olivia took as a sign of musical development, and then slid off the bench. I almost have it, Sophie said. Play it for me. Sophie played it. She almost had it. There was a section in the third line where her right hand anticipated the beat by a half count, which Olivia had no technical language for but could hear as a slight rushing. She listened without interrupting. When Sophie finished, she sat with her hands in her lap and looked at Olivia. The part in the middle, Olivia said, where it speeds up. You're going slightly early. I know, Sophie said, with the expression of someone who does know and finds this frustrating. My right hand doesn't wait. Make it wait. How? Play it slower than it needs to be until the timing is automatic. Then speed it back up. Sophie looked at her. That'll take forever. It'll take 2 weeks, Olivia said, which is not forever. It feels like forever. Most things that are worth getting right feel like forever while you're getting them right. Sophie considered this with the expression of an 8-year-old who is deciding whether an adult has said something genuinely wise or is using a tone that sounds wise to avoid admitting they don't have a better answer. She apparently landed on genuine because she turned back to the piano and played the section slower, and then again, and then again. Olivia went to the kitchen and made pasta. The simple kind, olive oil and garlic and parmesan, which she had learned by watching Ryan make it twice and which Sophie had declared acceptable after a period of measured skepticism. She listened to the piano from the kitchen and the sound of Sophie playing the same section over and over, slower and then slightly faster and then slower again, and the apartment was warm in the way of places that are lived in rather than inhabited. And she thought about the glass desk she'd never liked and the office she used to sleep in effectively, and the 1,200 people she now knew by name, some of them, more of them every month. Ryan came in at 6:45. He had 20 minutes before his shift. He looked tired in the specific way of someone who had been managing physical work and a child and a legal case and a consulting engagement and everything else, simultaneously, for a long time, without complaint and without resolution. He looked tired and also like himself, which she had come to understand were not contradictory things. How was the lesson? He asked, setting his bag down. She's almost there on the new piece, Olivia said. Right hand is rushing in the third line. She knows. She's been working on it. He looked toward the piano, where Sophie was still playing. You made pasta. It's on the stove. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. He looked at the stove and then at Olivia, and then at the piano room where his daughter was working on the same 4 measures with the focused stubbornness that was her most consistent quality, and his face did the thing it sometimes did, the brief, slightly undone expression of someone who is, in a specific moment, aware of how much they have and how unexpectedly it arrived. You don't have to do this every Wednesday, he said. It was not the first time he'd said it. I know, she said. It was not the first time she'd said that. He looked at her. Are you here because you think Sophie needs someone? Sophie is fine, Olivia said. Sophie will always be fine. She has you. Then why? She had thought about how to answer this question in the months since the Wednesday evenings had become a pattern. She had thought about it in the precise, analytical way she thought about most things, and she had arrived at an answer she believed was honest. Because this is the most real place I know, she said. And I spent a long time living in places that were constructed. That looked like the right things from the outside. She paused. This is just this. Sophie's piano and your pasta and a drawing of a horse on the refrigerator. And it's real. He was quiet for a moment. It's a dog, he said. She'll be upset that you thought it was a horse. I know. I'll tell her I knew it was a dog. She'll know you're lying. She'll appreciate the effort, Olivia said. He smiled. The real kind, the one he didn't produce for effect. She had been collecting these for 2 years without meaning to, the way you collect small, specific things that turn out to matter more than you'd have predicted. Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway. I got it slower, she said. The third line. I played it slow 5 times and it's better. Play it for me after dinner, Olivia said. Sophie looked at the pasta on the stove. Is there garlic bread? There's not garlic bread, Olivia said. Can you make garlic bread next time? I can try to make garlic bread next time. Dad's garlic bread is better, Sophie said, with the diplomatic honesty of an 8-year-old who has not yet learned that some truths are best left unspoken. Sophie, Ryan said. It is, though, Sophie said. It's not mean to say true things. Olivia caught Ryan's eye. He was doing the thing where he was visibly trying not to find his daughter funny in front of her because he didn't want to encourage the behavior. He was failing at it. Your father's garlic bread is better, Olivia agreed. He can make it next time. Sophie seemed satisfied with this conclusion. She climbed onto the kitchen stool and began telling them about something that had happened at school, a story that involved a substitute teacher, a misplaced hamster, and a sequence of events that grew more elaborate with each sentence. Ryan listened while he served the pasta. Olivia listened while she poured water. The kitchen was small and warm, and the window over the sink showed the November evening outside, the streetlights coming on, the Brooklyn sky going the specific dark blue of early winter evenings before it went fully dark. Ryan had to leave at 7. He put on his jacket and his bag and kissed the top of Sophie's head, and Sophie accepted this without interrupting the hamster story. He looked at Olivia briefly at the door. I'll be back at 6, he said. We'll be here, she said. He nodded. And then he went out, and the door closed, and Sophie continued the hamster story, and Olivia sat at the small kitchen table and listened, and outside the November evening deepened into night. She thought about Ryan later, driving home across the bridge with the city behind her and ahead of her both, the way it always was on the bridge, everything happening in both directions at once. She thought about who she had been 2 years ago, the person who slept in her office and didn't know the names of the people who cleaned it, who measured trust in duration and proximity, and had never considered whether those things were actually connected to trustworthiness, who had built something real and genuine and significant, and had also, in the building of it, managed to remain fundamentally alone inside it. She thought about who she was now. The answer was less simple, which she had come to believe was a good sign. Simple answers were usually constructed. She was still the person who worked too hard. She was still the person who converted fear into momentum as a first instinct. She was still not particularly good at asking for help, and still getting better at it. She still had days where the thing she was best at was the work, and days where she looked at the drawing on Ryan's refrigerator and understood something she couldn't have articulated when she was 28 and certain she knew what mattered. She was not a better CEO because she had learned to feel more. That was not how it worked. She was a better CEO because she had learned to see more clearly, to see the Patterson-shaped gaps in her systems, the Daniel Hargrove-shaped blind spots in her trust, the maintenance room-shaped realities of what a company actually was underneath the quarterly reports and the investor calls and the glass desk that looked serious in photographs. She had replaced the glass desk. She had done this 3 months after the verdict, not because anyone told her to or because it was symbolic, but because she had sat behind it for 4 years and never liked it, and she was done keeping things she didn't like because they looked right from the outside. The new desk was wooden and had a drawer that stuck slightly and a surface that showed scratches after 6 months of use. Her assistant had looked at it with an expression of polite confusion the first day and had not said anything about it, and Olivia had not explained it, and eventually the desk had simply become the desk, the way things become themselves when you stop explaining them. She thought about what it meant to succeed at something. She had been certain, for most of her adult life, that she knew the answer to that question. Revenue, market share, the specific weight of a company valued at $1 billion, and climbing. These were real. She didn't think they were meaningless. The 1,200 people who worked at Arcturus had jobs because those numbers were real, and jobs were not abstract things. They were the actual material of people's actual lives. She believed this, and she believed it mattered, but she had also believed, without examining it carefully, that the numbers were the point, that the building of the number was the thing she was actually doing, and everything else, the people, the culture, the walking the floors and learning the names, was infrastructure, the means to the end. She understood now that she had gotten that backward. The people were not the infrastructure of the numbers. The numbers were the evidence that the people were working. There was a difference, and the difference was not semantic. Success had not arrived for Arcturus Technologies in the 14 months after the verdict, because Olivia had gotten better at strategy or sharper at financial modeling or more aggressive in the market. Those things were all true, but they were not the reason. The reason was that she had started running the company in a way that made the people in it feel like they were building something real together, rather than executing someone else's vision of what the numbers should say. And people who feel that way about their work do it differently. They bring things forward instead of leaving them in the wrong drawer. They fix the inefficient process instead of working around it. They write the elegant code and they tell someone about it. She had learned this from a man who could have been earning 10 times his current salary, but had chosen instead to be home before his daughter woke up. She had not always understood what he was choosing, or why it was a choice rather than a limitation. She understood it now. He had not settled for a smaller life. He had built a different kind of large one where the things that mattered were the actual point, not the background. She didn't think you had to work nights and live in Crown Heights to live that way. She didn't think the lesson was about scale or simplicity. She thought the lesson was about knowing which things were real and making decisions that honored that, even when, especially when, the external pressures were pushing toward the constructed version, the version that looked right in photographs. The bridge ended. The city continued. She drove through it with the window cracked slightly, the November air cold and sharp and specific, and she thought, I am not done making mistakes. I'm not done getting things wrong. There will be another Daniel Hargrove somewhere in the years ahead. Not the same betrayal, but something, because that is the nature of building things with other people and trusting them with the parts that matter. There will be more mornings when the number on the screen is wrong, but there will also be Wednesdays in a warm kitchen. There will be a drawing of a dog on a refrigerator. There will be a girl playing the same 4 measures over and over, slower and then slightly faster, until the timing becomes automatic and the music becomes real. There will be, if she keeps paying attention, the continuing education of learning what she doesn't know yet, which was, she had come to believe, the only honest definition of a life that was going somewhere. She parked the car. She took the elevator up to her apartment, the one she had finally furnished, with actual furniture that she had chosen because she liked it, including a couch that was comfortable and didn't look particularly serious in photographs. She made tea. She sat on the couch. On her phone there was a text from Sophie. I played the third line slow 10 times. It's better now. I'll play it for you next Wednesday. And then, because Sophie was Sophie, also, you were right about the 2 weeks thing, probably. Olivia read it twice. She typed back, I'll be there. And then, because it was true, I already knew it was a dog. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. No, you didn't, Sophie wrote. But thank you for lying. Olivia set the phone down on the couch beside her and looked at the ceiling of her apartment, the one she lived in now, the one that was hers in the actual sense, not just the place where she kept her clothes. And she felt something that was quiet and specific and did not require a name. Outside, the city continued. It always continued. That was the thing about cities. They held everything, the entire weight of all the things happening simultaneously, the grief and the work, and the hamster stories and the small wooden desks that showed their scratches. And they kept going, indifferent and enormous. And inside all of it, the particular lives of people moved forward by the smallest possible increments, getting things wrong and correcting them, and getting up off the kitchen floor because someone needed them to be vertical. She had built a company worth more than $1 billion. She had also, she thought, finally started building something worth more than that. The slower, harder, less quantifiable thing. The version of herself that knew which things were real. The version that showed up on Wednesdays. The version that had learned, at the cost of a storm-struck November night and 9 weeks of investigation and a year of legal proceedings, that the people standing in front of you who you have not looked at carefully enough are sometimes the most important people in the room. She finished her tea. She went to bed. In the morning there was work and she was ready for it. And she was also, for the first time in a long time, ready for everything else.